Well, good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. Please feel free if you need to grab a coffee. If you don't know where the washrooms are, you just go towards the food and turn right, and then it's a little bit of a left jog. So it is a theater facility after all of that. And today we've got one bad actor in the room in Jim Williamson, so you'll get to meet him later on. No, Jim. You're wanted on stage all the time, Jim. Not to worry. Anyway, it's great to have everybody here this morning. For those of you I don't know, I know quite a few of you, but I may not have had the privilege of meeting some of you. My name is George Habib, and I always say I have the privilege of being the CEO for the Ontario Lung Association. I'd like to thank our hardworking staff for putting this and many other programs together. Thank you to Monica, Peter, and their teams for putting another fabulous program together. As you know, these policy forums are important to give us the background and the documentation to be able to enact policy change, much needed policy change. So thank you again for participating this morning. We're excited to be continuing this forum, and in particular the topic we'll talk about in a second. And each one of these is aimed at really developing creative and actionable solutions that are needed to improve the healthcare system in Ontario. And not just in Ontario, ladies and gentlemen, the work that we've done here at the Ontario Lung Association has really formed the background for significant policy change and movement in a couple of other provinces. So it really is taking hold in provinces like Saskatchewan and BC as an example. They've taken our work and really leveraged it as much as they can, and it really has enacted policy change in those provinces. We know that healthcare is facing some of the most urgent and pressing challenges, and we seem to say that at every one of these, but it's so true. And so this is really important to continue to drive hard on forums such as this. One that is obviously very relevant to us of that is the patient group engagement in public policy. We play a very important role in supporting patients living with lung disease and ensuring they have access to affordable and innovative treatments at the right time. However, there's always challenges, as you know, and opportunities that arise within these types of processes. So we wanted to bring together speakers with varying perspectives on these issues with the goal of improving the dialogue and consultation process between regulators and patient groups, specifically around healthcare. And more specifically, drug submissions, and now a topic that's so timely, national pharmacare. Before we get started, we couldn't do this without the significant support, not only in terms of treasure, but in time and talent of our sponsors. And we have three sponsors for this morning, AstraZeneca, and many of the team is here with Lee and Felicia, GSK, and thank you, Alain, and your team for jumping in here and being a significant contributor, actually, to formulating this policy. And our good friend Takeda, Jim Williamson. Jim, I was only kidding earlier. Do we have his money already? So we're good. Okay. Thank you very much to all of our sponsors for being here this morning. We do have a little longer day than what we normally have. So again, let's try to make it informal, and please make sure that you're comfortable. And in fact, I had to cook twice today. Not only are you going to get breakfast, but you're also going to get lunch. So. I'd like to acknowledge our speakers that are here today, all of whom will be properly introduced shortly. And I'll just name them for a minute, but they are in the program that's in front of you with their backgrounds and everything else. And again, we'll more deeply introduce them in a second. The list is Carly Weeks, Helen May, Jackie Manthorn, Catherine Booth, Zell Press, the Honorable Diana Whalen, Dr. Monica Slavenik-D'Angelo, and Louise Binder. So we also encourage you to take the conversation online by using our hashtag #BreathingForum. I'd now like to introduce our first speaker and moderator of our panel discussions later on. Carly Weeks has been a national health reporter for the Globe and Mail for 12 years and established a reputation as a fearless journalist who routinely shines a spotlight on important issues. She has broken a number of major national news stories, being the first to report on anti-vaccine billboards being placed in the Greater Toronto Area, and a campaign led by a firearm lobby group to discredit a trauma surgeon calling for stricter gun laws in Canada. Both really important issues. Weeks has won several awards for her coverage. Please join me in welcoming Carly Weeks. Carly?
Thank you for that kind introduction, and thanks everyone for being here today. I'm really looking forward to a great discussion, and I'm sure you are all as well. And before we get going and hear from all of our speakers, I just wanted to give a bit of an overview of what the landscape looks like when we talk about patient engagement and the drug submission process, and also more broadly patient engagement and public policy and some of the major issues there. Obviously, I'm a journalist, so I'm not the expert when it comes to patient groups or public policy, but as an observer and someone who has been watching and talking to different players for a number of years, there's a lot of interesting observations that I think we can make about the changing landscape and everything that's going on right now. Also, given the fact that we're in the middle of an election campaign, a lot more changes are certain to come, so we can talk more about that later. So, first, the good news. More and more organizations and leaders within the healthcare space are recognizing the importance of patient engagement and bringing patient voices in. So I increasingly hear from and talk to hospitals, official government bodies, other public policy organizations that are bringing patient advisors on, that are including patients and their family members in the process, researchers who are talking to people with direct experience before they begin their research trials, and there's many, many more examples of this, and I think that that's a really positive thing. On the flip side of that, we do sometimes hear the criticism from some of these patients themselves that sometimes this engagement does amount to lip service, and the concern that the patients are brought in but not necessarily listened to. And so I think that there is still a little bit of a disconnect between having the patient at the table and then incorporating their feedback into the policy decisions or other public policy issues and things like that. So that's one of the major tensions that I hear about quite often. And I think that that's something that still does need to be addressed in a meaningful way, but there's obviously some challenges that are involved there. And when it comes to the drug submission process more specifically, there are some other challenges. So, we often hear that Health Canada and other official bodies are not transparent enough. We know very little about how decisions get made, how the sausages get made in the back room, and so there is this feeling from the outsider's perspective that there is some secrecy. There's not necessarily any malicious things, but it makes it difficult for patients to get involved more meaningfully every step of the way when you have sort of more of that opaque process. And then patient groups themselves face a lot of their own challenges. So there's a number of obstacles, such as a relatively short turnaround time for making comments official. You need to basically be aware of something that's going on, be alerted, be ready to make a very meaningful submission. And this can be very difficult to do for a lot of patient groups that struggle for funding, struggle with staff members, some that are just even volunteer-based and things like that. So that can be a challenge as well, to make sure that input is being heard. And then there's obviously the industry connection. So we know that the industry is obviously engaging with regulators and in public policy matters, and oftentimes they will work with a lot of patient groups to help further those discussions along. And so from the patient group perspective, industry funding is a vital way to make sure that they can actually get their voices heard and be part of that conversation, but this also can raise some complicated questions about potential conflicts of interest. There's been some studies that have been done in Canada by Joel Lechkin. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with his work at York University, who did find there was a connection between patient group funding and the drug submission process, in that a lot of the groups that received funding were more positive in sort of advocating for a certain drug to be brought to market. So one of the issues perhaps we can discuss is how do you address that? On the flip side, as we mentioned, it's difficult for organizations to get their work done without any of this funding, which I believe led a number of groups to actually go to the government a year or so ago and say, okay, then you help us. So there's no easy answers here. So if we truly value the patient voice, then what does this mean? Is there some sort of significant shakeup or change that needs to take place to ensure that those conversations are happening in a meaningful way? So one example I found of another country that's trying a different approach in a sense is the US Food and Drug Administration. So a couple of years ago, they started basically a series of meetings. So instead of just during the drug submission process, they'll have a consultation period and there's this ongoing discussion. They started a series of meetings that basically focused on a disease topic. So autism was one, lupus, kidney disease, and things like that. And so what they would do is they would have regulators, industry, and patient groups all brought together, and they would have a very meaningful discussion about all of the issues that patients are facing. So sort of like a town hall meeting where patients could identify what their priorities were. The reason why this is so significant, and it's a bit different from what we often see happen, is that in these cases, they weren't talking about a specific treatment or a specific policy measure. They were basically just setting the agenda. Patients were setting out sort of their laundry list of things that they wanted to see happen. So according to some patient groups there's treatments that might not otherwise have actually been approved as a result. So there is a particular drug that helps skin cancer patients. So skin cancer patients told one of these groups that one of the things that bothers them is skin lesions, and they wanted to see their skin lesions go away. And so they said, this is a priority for us, and this, the physical appearance. And so this led the FDA to, in part, not just because of this feedback, but in part to approve a drug that could help with this, because they realized this is high on the patient's agenda. And so, there's a number of different approaches that can be taken and a number of different issues, and we'll discuss all of those. But one thing does seem certain, and I think is really important and powerful, is that the patient voice is not going away, and if anything, it's just going to be louder and louder. And this we can thank, I think, in large part to social media. For better or worse, social media provides a platform for a number of different people to express their views. As was mentioned, I've been doing a lot of work talking about anti-vaccination advocates, but we see a lot of really great work that's being done by patient advocates on the ground, just, people who are in their homes. They're not necessarily part of an organized network, who are, really making waves. And I've come across many heartbreaking and inspiring stories from patients and their families who are, basically bringing their voice to the conversation in a way that they couldn't have done 10, 20, perhaps even 5 years ago. And then one thing to keep in mind, and perhaps we can talk about this in more detail, but I often think about who the people are that we're engaging. So it's really great and important to improve patient engagement, but it's also important to think about the types of people that might not be showing up. So sometimes patient advocates and advisors are a self-selected group who have the resources and time to dedicate to these initiatives. And there's oftentimes people who might be somehow marginalized. We think of newcomers to Canada, people who speak English as a second language, people who are from a lower socioeconomic status who cannot afford to attend, a panel or take part in some consultation. And so I think it's important to think about ways that those groups, those people can also be included in some of those conversations. And I thought I'd just share one memorable anecdote about the power of patient engagement before we get things started with our speakers. So a couple of years ago, I was actually doing a presentation on patient engagement, and I spoke to a kidney researcher who told me that they had a series of studies that they were going to be embarking on. But before they did them, they decided to go to the patients and ask them, well, what do you want? Like, what do you want us to focus on? And they expected the patients to say, cure this disease, fix this, I want to be off dialysis. And they were quite shocked to hear the patients say that they wanted relief from the constant itching that they were experiencing and the restless leg syndrome, which were just, irritating, life-disrupting symptoms that were a major priority. And the researchers were sort of stunned to hear this, but they ended up devoting, I think, 2 research projects in this area. So these things are still underway. But that's the power when you actually include and listen to the patient voice, finding those answers that matter to real people. So there's many things happening in this space in Canada, and I'm really looking forward to bringing up the experts here who can explain their perspective from the ground. So first up, I'm going to be introducing Helen Mai. So Helen is the Policy and Strategic Advisor with CADTH's Pan-Canadian Oncology Review Program. Before joining CADTH, Helen worked at the Ontario Ministry of Health as a Senior Program Analyst. Helen has a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Windsor and was called to the bar in 2007. And she was also a former respiratory therapist in Quebec. So please welcome Helen to the stage.
Thank you so much, Carly, for the kind introduction. And certainly, I'd like to thank the Ontario Lung Association for really inviting me to present here today. As you know, patient engagement is one of the core commitments of CADTH's strategic plan. And in my work at CADTH, I've been privileged to work with many of the patient group members. I'm certainly inspired by the dedication and the passion that the patient community brings, and also the willingness to collaborate on initiatives to certainly enhance patient engagement in our healthcare system, but also in particular in the health technology assessment. So for my part today, I plan to focus in on the pharmaceutical space and provide you with really a high-level overview of the drug approval process, and certainly outline some of the key differences between regulatory versus HTA. I'll also provide a short snapshot of some of the patient engagement initiatives in the HTA sphere and how this has been applied. My objective is really to make the case why patient engagement in HTA is important, and hopefully to kickstart the discussion on opportunities to enhance patient engagement in HTA. So in case some of you who may not be familiar with CADTH, which is the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Health and Technologies, we are an independent, not-for-profit organization responsible for providing healthcare decision makers with objective evidence to help make informed decisions about the use of optimal technologies. And of course, that includes both drugs and medical devices. So in addition to the evidence, we also provide advice, recommendations, and also tools to support decision makers. We certainly have a suite of programs and services, but of course, the focus of today's discussion will be really on our 2 main pharmaceutical programs, namely the Common Drug Review and the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review. So many of you will be familiar with the drug approval process, but I think it may really be good to simply provide a bit of an overview to set the context and to support the discussion for today. So as many of you know, there are key steps for the drug review process in Canada. So before a drug can be sold in Canada, Health Canada must issue its approval to market through what it's called a notice of compliance. In terms of public funding, a new drug or indication is generally required to be either submitted to CADTH or to INES, which is the Quebec's Institut National d'Excellence en Santé et en Services Sociaux for health technology assessment. And certainly we'll go into a bit of details in the next slide about regulatory versus HTA. As you can see, CADTH has really 2 key programs, which I've mentioned earlier, which is the CDR for the non-oncology and PCODER for the oncology drug products. So once a recommendation is issued through the HTA process, the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance will support jurisdictions through joint negotiations to really ensure value for publicly funded drug programs. And of course, the final funding decision really rests with the participating jurisdictions. So from time to time, we get asked, what is HTA? And really, how is this different from the regulatory process? So here you can see we've outlined really a brief summary table comparing the two. So in the latter case, you'll see that the objective of the regulatory approval is really to allow the sale of drugs in Canada. And the regulatory approval process really assesses whether or not the drug works for the intended purpose, what the risks or side effects are, but certainly does not determine costs. In contrast, the objective of HTA is really to make recommendations for reimbursement by publicly paid drug programs, and of course for decision makers to decide whether or not to fund the drug. So in terms of the HTA, we evaluate the benefits and the risks of treatments compared to either existing treatments or in certain cases to best supportive care where there are no other treatments. Because available resources may be limited and must be allocated appropriately based on the effectiveness and affordability, HTA really helps to inform decision makers by asking questions such as, for whom does the drug work and when? Is it better than what we already have? How will it be used? And what are potentially some of the trade-offs? So HTA, we will assess the clinical evidence, the patient evidence, the cost effectiveness, and certainly the implementation considerations to make a recommendation. So patient engagement has certainly evolved over the years. So what I wanted to do was really set out a snapshot of patient engagement in HTA in Canada. This really intended to be a quick highlight of some of the key milestones, and it's certainly not all encompassing. So in the pharmaceutical space, there certainly have been much effort amongst the governments to work together. Many of you may have recalled that in the early 1990s, a national pharmaceutical strategy was actually set up to coordinate efforts on a number of pharmaceutical issues across Canada. But certainly it wasn't until around 2001 where the federal, provincial, and territorial health ministers announced a number of initiatives in the area of pharmaceuticals, including the establishment of a single common review process for coverage of new drugs in Canada, and as you all now know, as the Common Drug Review. So in developing this process, there was a broad consultation with a wide range of stakeholders, including patients. But direct public and patient involvement in drug review processes and recommendation was actually, in fact, realized in the mid-2000s, and specifically in 2006, where public members were appointed on the expert committee. And as many of you know, an interim joint oncology drug review process was developed in 2007, which was really leveraged on the Ontario model, and patient members were also involved in the recommendation process. But really in looking at enhancing the drug review process, it was in 2010 with the establishment of a permanent oncology process where there was a formalized deliberative framework to incorporate the key quadrants, which was to look at the clinical benefits, to look at patient values, the economic evaluations, as well as the adoption and feasibility. And in strengthening the process, patient values is really used by our review team and expert committee to understand the patient experiences and their perspectives on their illnesses and their treatments. And I'll certainly speak a bit more about this in the next slide. But to consider a much more holistic approach to greater patient engagement, we at CADTH actually collaborated with a small working group of patient representatives to develop a framework which was implemented earlier in January of this year for patient engagement in HTA. And the framework focuses on how CADTH engages with patients, with whom and across the different programs and processes. So the framework was really adapted from the HTAI values and standards for patient involvement in HTA, which really includes the key principles around relevance, fairness, equity, legitimacy, and capacity building. We also heard from the patient community who emphasized the need for patient voices to be heard by those involved in the governance, including with CADTH's board. And as such, we established a patient and community advisory committee this summer in July to help CADTH understand how its policies and activities will impact patients, families, and communities, and certainly to help raise awareness of the needs of all those who use the Canadian healthcare system, and as Carly mentioned earlier, especially with the vulnerable and the disadvantaged. So patient involvement and patient input matters in HTA. We recognize that HTA recommendations for a specific drug technology will affect patients. From an HTA perspective, understanding experiences of the patients and caregiver is a key element in making that recommendation for the drug. Our review team and expert committee wants to understand what matters most to patients and caregivers when they think about the treatments they may be taking or need to take in the future. Because patient evidence can provide the real-world evidence through their lived experience, it's important to hear about both the benefits and the challenges with the treatments. So as an example, I recall from one of our reviews, we heard from patients described that an oral therapy is certainly more convenient than going to the hospital for chemo treatment. However, there was a high pill burden with having to swallow so many pills. So this type of information allows our reviewers to appreciate certainly the impact, both the good and the bad, that the drug may have on those taking the treatment, and certainly also for those who are caring for patients living with the condition. Patients and their caregivers can also provide the perspectives on the most important considerations and outcomes for the new drug under review. So here we wanted to provide you with a bit of a snapshot on, with respect to the patient involvement in both of our drug review processes. And it's a period of over 8+ years. We can see that within the common drug review, we've had patient input for about 87% of all our reviews, and we've had about 97% patient input for the oncology reviews. So over the years, we've had a total of actually 180 distinct patient groups, both in the CDR and the PCODER process. So I've outlined earlier why patient input is important. So I think it may be helpful to outline how it's actually used. So we ask for input early in the review process, as this really helps us to develop the review protocol where outcomes and issues that are important to patients are provided to the review team. And this information is actually incorporated in both our clinical and our economic reports. We notify the patient community by sending out alerts about 6 weeks in advance to let people know about an upcoming drug submission. Of course, there is a catch. Because of the anti-spam law in Canada, a person must actually subscribe with CADTH in order to receive our notices. So what the patient input helps to inform the patient values really on important outcomes, such as improved quality of life, potentially decreased symptoms, better disease control, and of course, potentially extending survival. This information is also shared with our participating jurisdictions. So this is really an example of how patient input is used. I know it's a very fine print, so I'll give a brief summary. This is certainly only but one example. All our reports and recommendations are publicly available, but in this specific example, we heard from 46 patients who reported experience with the drug under review, and patients reported on the most common side effects, and whether or not they were tolerable, as well as the impact on the quality of life. And many of these respondents really anticipated the extension of their remission period. Because patients considered adverse events, the quality of life, and survival as important factors for their condition, all three factors were considered in the economic analysis. Our committee also acknowledged the large number of respondents and proportion of patients with experience. Certainly, our PERT committee appreciated the balanced perspective that patient experienced, both the positive and the negative results that were included, and certainly commented on the quality of the input. They took into consideration that patients value having effective treatment options, improvement in quality of life, and having a choice of therapies as the key outcomes that are really important for this population. So here, over the years, we've worked with a number of the patient community to co-develop some resources, such as some guidance documents, as well as some templates to support patient involvement with our drug process. A key issue I think we've heard is really around timing and notice for patient groups to prepare a submission. So I just wanted to highlight one key resource that may be helpful is that we have what we call the Cancer Drug Pipeline information for patient groups. And this was developed in 2017. This was certainly a collaboration with the Canadian Cancer Action Network and our program to support patient groups with longer lead time to make a submission. This is still currently funded and maintained by the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer. So it's really a centralized source of information of pipeline phase 2 and phase 3 drugs that could be submitted to Canada. And of course, these resources are available on our website. So we recognize that there are certainly different opportunities for patient involvement with CADTH and with HTA. And certainly with the establishment of the Patient and Community Advisory Committee, we look forward to really hearing from this committee on how we can be more inclusive of the different perspectives, including outreach to the different communities. We also hope to gain insights as to how we can potentially prioritize some of the technologies for review in Canada, as well as really to advise, hear their advice on some of our operational matters, such as greater transparency in our reports and committee recommendations. So we have, as you may know, some consultations underway, and certainly would welcome to hear from the patient community on some of our proposal, including our reassessment framework, as well as the proposal for transparency of our reports and recommendation. These are certainly some of the opportunities that I think we can have further dialogue on. So I really like to thank you for your time, and I'll pass the baton to the next speaker.
Thank you, Helen. That was really great and really informative. And so we'll jump right in to bring up our next speaker, which is Jackie Manthorn, who is President and CEO of the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network, a national network of patients, families, survivors, friends, community partners, and sponsors. Its mission is to work together by taking action to promote the very best standard of care, support, follow-up, and quality of life for patients and survivors. It aims to educate the public and policymakers about cancer and encourage research on ways to alleviate the barriers to optimal cancer care in Canada. So please welcome Jackie.
Good morning. I left my real glasses in Ottawa, so I'm working with a pair of readers. So if I'm not reading too well, let me know, or I will know. Thank you, Carly, and thank you to the Ontario Lung Association for inviting me to attend and speak at this event. We have, that's a lot of words, and Carly read some of them, But basically, we've developed into a public policy house. And along with that, we are really committed to patient engagement. As I talk through some of the activities that we do, I will also mention how patients, caregivers, and survivors are involved. But one thing I'd like to say, which I realized I left out of my slides, is that we are working on a Science of Cancer course, which will be a 10-module e-education course. And we actually have most of the modules, scripts for most of the modules written, and about 3 or 4 of them are in first, second, third draft, and about to be reviewed by patients and caregivers and survivors. We'll be offering this to the wider patient community. It will, free of charge, and it will provide much information that we feel that they need to be able to hold their own on, for example, research peer review committees, clinical trial design teams, and anywhere else where some knowledge of the science of cancer is required. We were created in 2011 by a group. I'm one of the founders. There were a group of us, some who had worked in cancers and some who were cancer patients. I will just say that one of them has recently died of pancreatic cancer. We're a registered charity. We launched our website in 2012. We have a medical advisory committee that continues to grow. We have several advisory councils and over 60 partner groups across the country, from very small support groups to very large organizations, in fact, that are larger than we are. You can see here some of our statistics, and when we created the group, we decided that it wouldn't work for us to have regional offices. We decided we were going to live on social media and our website, and also on travel. So I'm very often not in Ottawa, as those who know me know. But we have over 10,000 subscribers to our e-letter. We have a very active Facebook community. Over the holidays at one point, there was quite a heated discussion going on about access to treatment and the lack thereof sometimes, and someone posted, "It's Trump's fault." And as you can imagine, we all had to jump in and navigate that conversation and say, wait a minute, we're Canadian, it isn't Trump's fault in this instance. We have over 6,000 followers on our Twitter feed. Many of you will know we have a bi-weekly webinar series, which will be starting up again at the beginning of October, with a webinar about how patients can be involved legitimately in the federal election. And it'll go on from there. We also ask questions, and we counted them up, 22 provincial, territorial, and federal elections. And I know there are other groups that do this, but I think we are unique in the sense that we also ask all the candidates for whom we can find an email address, or we've even tweeted and Facebooked some candidates. This is to raise awareness of people who are movers and shakers in their communities, and one of them is going to be elected, and we then are looking for champions after the election who we can be in contact with. We do legislative receptions at Queen's Park and on Parliament Hill. We've had 4 all-party Cancer Caucus meetings at Queen's Park, and one so far in the Alberta Legislature. These are receptions, these are caucus meetings which have representatives of every party. Our last one in Ontario, we had at least one representative from each party, including the only Green member. The presentations are made by patients, caregivers, and survivors. We have dealt with, on the whole, in all of these caucus meetings, the issue of the lack of rehabilitation services for cancer survivors. The last one was about lymphedema. We are, in our next e-letter, going to ask patients and caregivers and survivors what rehab topic they think would be a good topic for the next meeting, which is in early December. We will then have some of them ask some of them to come and present on it. One area that has come up is pain and pain management, which is a topic which is being discussed so much, but right now. We've also dealt with the fact that take-home cancer drugs have to be paid for in Ontario. And we've dealt with PSA screening for men in the Cancer Caucuses. We also plan to have an all-party Cancer Caucus on the Hill. We've started to talk with MPs about that, and obviously now we're waiting till after the election, and in British Columbia and perhaps Manitoba. On to the patient group submissions to PCODR and CADTH. We've made dozens. I didn't stop to count them, but Helen will tell you that, for many kinds of cancer, and a few to CADTH for treatment for pain and also chemo-induced nausea and vomiting. And we've made quite a few to NS as well. We usually use, our submissions use surveys where we collect information, and when we've been able to, when we've had the resources, we've also done qualitative interviews and made that submission as well. Our last submission, which was not that long ago, was on a treatment for prostate cancer where we had 92 patients respond to our survey, and we interviewed 5 patients on a clinical trial. Helen and I were talking about this before the event started, but I believe we were the first group to submit, do a PCODR submission, spearheaded on behalf of 7 cancer groups for a new treatment for rare, what could be described as rare cancers that appeared in lung, colorectal, thyroid, sarcoma, and several children's cancers. This was our first submission for a new treatment for several cancers, and in some ways it was like herding cats because everyone is really busy. And we all collaborated to develop the survey, and then we all fielded it. It was a success. Every group was involved. The issue was that it was rare, so it was difficult sometimes to find patients. Some of the groups also did their own qualitative submissions. What works, really? Well, why does it work? It gives patient groups like ours opportunity to share real-world evidence, the lived experiences of patients. I think partnering with other groups really works as well as that submission from 7 different groups. We've partnered with Prostate Cancer Canada, Lung Cancer Canada, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, and several other cancer groups. Sometimes we've partnered on the whole thing. Sometimes we've done a survey, they've done qualitative, and more recently, sometimes some of the groups have also done clinician submissions. Partnering can certainly benefit smaller groups, and it can benefit groups that are learning how to do a submission. It can be, the first time you do one, it can be really difficult in trying to figure out what you should do, what's good, what's bad. I remember getting feedback on one that we'd done that had very, very few patients, and one bit of advice that has stood us well over the years is that if you only have 6 patients for a rare cancer who responded, don't use percentages. Use the actual number. And that seems very obvious, but it may not be if you're just learning how to do submissions. But partnering can help all groups reach more patients, undertake both qualitative and quantitative work, and identify clinicians or additional clinicians who might be able to do a clinical submission. Okay, so it wouldn't actually be me if I didn't make some suggestions for improvements or changes. PCODR and CADTH should certainly approach more groups and ask them to prepare submissions when there's no group representing that cancer in Canada. For example, we were asked to prepare submissions on head and neck cancer, Merkel cell carcinoma, and gastric cancer because there were no groups. And Helen, when you saw the statistics that Helen presented on how many submissions they are, I think an unintended consequence has been that if there's no patient group submission, members of PERC might think, what's wrong with this treatment? Maybe it doesn't really work. There are no patients interested in it. So when there isn't any group, we certainly welcome calls, and because we are involved in all cancers, but I know that other groups might as well. I often have thought that we should ask patients that we know from our advisory councils or just from meeting them at various events to write or even make a video about their own experience. And we would submit it along with the rest of our submission. This would be one way of dealing with the fact that it can be very resource heavy and therefore expensive to do qualitative submissions. The fact that collaboration can work, and the fact that collaboration will become even more important as more and more treatments are developed that instead of one cancer, one treatment, are one treatment, multiple cancers, because they're looking at mutations or biomarkers. And in that case, collaboration really is necessary. There should be meaningful communication between patient groups and the patient members of PERC, not to try to convince them about a certain treatment or anything, but so that we know who they are. Maybe some patient groups know who they are, but I don't think that this is across the board, and I would leave it to Helen to figure out how that could be done. We should really have more time to prepare submissions. In the cases of rare cancers, or where there are very few Canadian clinical trials, if any, going on, it takes longer to gather the evidence that we need to do the submission. Why should patients be involved? And I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about that, and then just a bit of time to talk about public perception. They've lived the experience. I would never put my name on a submission as a patient unless I had lived the experience. So it's really important for us to be able to reach those patients, to have that information. And I really do believe that last statement, that quality in healthcare is shaped by the experiences and wisdom of patients, families, caregivers, and the public. When we were doing a training session for patients, caregivers, and survivors who were going to be speaking at our all-party cancer caucus, one of the patients said to me, I'm really, really, really nervous. I don't know how I'm going to do this. I don't know anything. I said, did you have cancer? She said, yes. And I said, well, that's what you know. And that's what they want to know about. They want to know about your experiences, in that case, with lymphedema after cancer, and the fact that you couldn't get it paid for. Public perception is a difficult thing. I know that there have recently been some attempts to invalidate the work of patient groups in media. My response to that is, as someone who works for a patient group, I know that what we're doing, that there's nothing wrong with what we're doing. As you had mentioned about groups maybe working a bit more enthusiastically on PCODER submissions because they were funded by that particular pharmaceutical, I think that has to be met head on. Groups should not be ashamed of or nervous about where their funding comes from. And the reason they shouldn't is because they are doing hands-off submissions. Have we been asked by pharmaceuticals to do submissions? Yes. Have we been asked by PCODER? Yes. Have we done submissions of drugs where we've never had funding from a specific pharmaceutical company? Yes. So for us, in fact, one of the first ones we did was on a new treatment that was being submitted by a company that we had never talked to. So I think the groups have to look at being transparent and facing criticism head on, and realizing that if we are being transparent and honest and fair in what we're doing, then we have nothing to worry about, we have nothing to be ashamed about. Personally, as someone who's been around that criticism, which comes around cyclically, and I've worked in cancer for almost 20 years, at first in breast cancer and now at CCSN. So I've seen this before, and after a few instances of being interviewed and seeing what I said twisted, I decided that I won't do interviews by being done by someone whose mind is already made up. And I think we have to be smart about that. I don't know what else to say about it, but I think that public perception is something that we have to work on. And I think that we work on it with the patients, caregivers, and survivors we're involved with. And I don't think they have that feeling. They don't have a feeling that they're being used. They have a feeling that they're participating. And just one other thing, early on in our 8 years, we did a survey of patients and how they felt about being involved in advocacy and different kinds of advocacy. It was the results were interesting because a lot of them said, nothing ever changes. We may give our heart and soul to something, but nothing ever changes. And those of us who volunteer or work in this area know that this is a long game. It's a long-term process. So I actually presented the results of that survey at CAPO, the Canadian Association of Psychosocial Oncology, one year at their annual conference. And my recommendations were that if you work with volunteers in public policy or advocacy, you need to support them and not let them just hang out there after they've been somewhere and made a major presentation, and the next day nothing happens, even the next year. So that's something that we've realized, but I think it's a good point. And I think when we had calls after some of those articles appeared in the newspaper that were critical of groups, we had calls from some of the patients we work with who said, well, what's going on? And so we had conversations, we had honest conversations, and we came out the other end. And I think that that's all we can do. We need to stay strong within ourselves, within our groups, and realizing that we're working to change things so that people have better experiences in treatment. And that can be cancer, but it could be also other chronic diseases. So I've gone on, I'm sure, too long. But I wanted to get that point across as well, because I think often it's the elephant in the room. And I think, we should turn it into a little mouse. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. That was really interesting, and I have many questions I'd love to ask. So hopefully during the Q&A we'll get some of those in. So next up, I'm going to introduce Catherine Booth. So Catherine is an associate professor of political science at McMaster University and a member of the McMaster Center for Health Economics and Policy Analysis. She has written on the development and reform of pharmaceutical benefits in Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom, and changes to the drug assessment process in Canada. She is the author of Ideas in the Pace of Change, National Pharmaceutical Insurance in Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom, and has published work in the Journal of Health Policy, Politics and Law, the Canadian Journal of Political Science, and Health Economics Policy and Law. So, Catherine, please come up.
So thanks very much for that introduction, and thank you to the Lung Association for having me. I'm really pleased to get to be a part of this conversation today. I'm going to start with disclosures. I'm going to talk about some of my research, and the research is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada through their Insight Development Grant Program. So today I want to talk very briefly about the history of public and patient involvement, picking up on some of what Helen has said. So what's the starting point for this process? Where are we coming from? And then I'm going to present some of my research on how various participants in the drug assessment process understand the goals of public and patient involvement and how these understandings have changed over time. The research that I'm presenting is research in progress. So I'm also going to take the opportunity to ask what you see as key unanswered questions about public and patient involvement, and I'll hope that you might have some suggestions about future research priorities during the question and answer. So I am, in doing my work, I'm particularly interested in ideas about legitimacy. And to explain why, I'd like us to think back to when public and patient involvement was first added to Canadian drug assessment. So as Helen discussed, between 2006 and 2010, we see the addition of public or patient members to the CDR committee, to PCODR, and to a number of provincial drug advisory committees, along with the introduction of written submissions to committees from patient groups. And these policy changes were in some important ways driven by a perceived need to increase the public legitimacy of drug assessment, to change people's ideas about it. They were a response to patient groups' growing dissatisfaction with the drug assessment process. Patients wanted greater transparency and they wanted to be included. However, if we go back to the 2007 parliamentary committee hearings where some of these ideas were discussed, we can also see that experts at this time saw the process as one that was already rigorous and effective, that was working fairly well. And while they acknowledged opportunities for greater openness, they also expressed concerns about the subjective nature of patient input and the potential for conflicts of interest, which Jackie mentioned. So this is the backdrop for the adoption of public and patient involvement in drug assessment. There's these tensions between different understandings of what public and patient involvement was supposed to do and what makes for quote unquote good, legitimate drug assessment processes. And these tensions were acknowledged early on. A 2012 report to CADTH evaluating the patient submission process noted that, and I'm quoting here, patients, committee members, stakeholders, manufacturers, and CADTH staff are not fully aligned on the objective of the patient input process, end quote. So this is where my research begins. I want to know if and how different groups of participants have changed their ideas about public and patient involvement since it was first introduced. And to answer this question, I analyzed participants' early ideas using a number of consultancy reports and parliamentary hearings published between 2005 and 2012. And then I conduct open-ended interviews with current or former participants. So I started this process with 2 pilot interviews in 2014, and since that time I've interviewed 22 committee members, officials, and members of patient groups. So my research so far, earlier this year I published the first results of the research in an open access journal article, and this article analyzes changes in the views of each group of participants. So technical committee members, patient and public members, patient group representatives, and officials. And the key findings from this research were first, the interviews demonstrated some consensus across groups of participants regarding the broad goals of health technology assessment and the validity of some form of public and patient involvement. I also found some important areas of disagreement and uncertainty about how public and patient involvement should be used and how much impact it has on deliberations and recommendations, right? Measuring impact was kind of a key concern for a lot of different participants. My current research drills down on the views of technical members of drug advisory committees. So by this, I just mean everyone who's not a patient or public member, so clinicians, pharmacists, economists, ethicists. And I'm asking, have technical members' ideas about legitimacy changed since public and patient involvement was first introduced? And the paper focuses on technical members because, as a group, they are particularly likely to hold ideas about HTA that are challenged by public and patient involvement. Okay, so their ideas about what makes for a good, legitimate scientific process are part of their professional identity and worldview, so are expected to be deeply held beliefs. And so as a framework for understanding participants' ideas, I come back to this idea of legitimacy. And by legitimacy, I mean the different ways that participants might judge both an HTA process as a whole and public and patient involvement in that process. And I think about it as two different conceptions of legitimacy, a scientific and a democratic conception. And I've simplified a bit here by saying scientific legitimacy is primarily focused on outcomes, on making, again, good, efficient, equitable, scientifically rigorous drug listing recommendations. It comes with particular ideas about what counts as evidence and places a high value on the idea of objectivity. Democratic legitimacy, on the other hand, is primarily focused on process. Is the process inclusive, accountable, transparent? Of course, democratic conceptions of legitimacy still care about outcomes, but the definition of a good outcome or good recommendation might be made on slightly different bases. So the paper that I'm working on right now uses this framework to describe a starting point where technical members emphasized scientific conceptions of legitimacy for drug assessment and saw democratic conceptions mainly as a challenge to the scientific rigor of the process. It asks whether, as a group, technical members now express ideas about legitimacy differently. And there's two findings that I'd like to highlight this morning that I think illustrate the complicated nature of legitimacy when it comes to drug assessment. First, there was some consensus among the technical members I interviewed about the value of public and patient members of the committee. They were seen as enhancing the accountability and transparency of the committee, and many interviewees mentioned the important role that they saw these members playing. So, for example, one interviewee said, if you don't have a lay member, there could always be a critic that says, how do I know you're emphasizing patient values? There's no patient on your committee, there's no public member. And so I agree with that criticism, and I think having someone there from an optics point of view makes a lot of sense. Another interviewee said, I think the presence of lay members is essential to really make sure that when we go out with a recommendation, it's clear to the public why that recommendation was made. The second finding was about the way technical members I interviewed seemed to be reconciling ideas about scientific and democratic legitimacy when it came to patient submissions. Throughout the study period, there's a consistent emphasis on key elements of scientific legitimacy, like the necessity of, quote, good technical, clinical, epidemiologic information, and concerns about bias when accepting input from patient groups who may receive industry funding, although the nature of those concerns, I think, has changed a bit over time. There was, however, fairly broad consensus that patient input could improve decisions by helping the committee value health outcomes. And this consensus was not present in earlier periods, and I think we've also heard it this morning from other presenters. So I heard many different variations of this statement from a technical member who said, for many conditions, the patient ultimately needs to be the person to advise. What are the outcomes that are important to them? So a challenge here is that technical members sometimes reported difficulty evaluating patient input or getting input that met their perceived needs. When they talk about the best case scenario for patient input, they talk about ways to make it more like scientific evidence. So two illustrative quotes. One interviewee said, "I certainly don't think there's any theory behind how that information, meaning patient submissions, is presented, whereas there's lots of theory behind how the clinical evidence and the economic evaluation stuff is presented." Another member said, "I would like the patient groups to be a bit more critical of the evidence, if they can be." So, patient evidence and input is potentially valued for its contribution to a better decision, or it's valued on the condition that it approaches the standards for scientific legitimacy. This may mean that it is difficult for technical members to fully accept the democratic rationale for public and patient involvement. And it's also unclear if acting as an alternate source of data for an HTA process fulfills patient groups' desire for inclusion. My takeaways from the research so far are, first, in terms of stability and change and technical members' ideas, I find the highest levels of acceptance for democratic conceptions of legitimacy as they relate to public and patient members of the committee, and some more mixed evidence for ideational change when it comes to written submissions from patient groups. At this point, it appears that greater acceptance for patient submissions is predicated, at least with this group, is predicated on them approaching scientific standards for legitimacy rather than their fulfillment of democratic requirements for legitimacy. I hope that the next steps of the research will involve a new series of interviews with patient groups to learn about their ideas for about the process, especially in light of some of the updates to the policies that Helen mentioned. And none of those changes have been captured by my research to date. I'd welcome your thoughts about future research questions. What do you see as key gaps in the understanding of and the dialogue about public and patient involvement? And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Catherine. That was really enlightening. And we'll jump right into our next speaker. And I'd like to introduce Zal Press, who is the Vice Chair of the CADTH Patient and Community Advisory Committee, which provides CADTH with advice on issues relevant to its mandate from the perspective of those using the Canadian healthcare system. He was the founding co-chair of the Beryl Institute Global Patient and Family Advisory Board, which works to ensure that the voices of patients and families are a central consideration in the strategic direction and offerings of the Institute. He founded and serves as the Executive Director of Patient Commando, an organization that is dedicated to lifting the veil of silence that so often accompanies the onset of illness. Please welcome Zal.
Where's the clicker? Good morning, and thank you, Carly, for that lovely introduction. Okay. So, oh, here we go. I'll get it. No, I didn't get it. Never mind, I didn't get it. Anyways, good morning, I'm Zal Press. I'm with Patient Commando, and yes, I'm an independent patient voice, and I'm the vice chair of the new CADTH Patient Community Advisory Council that Helen referred to earlier, but I'm not going to talk about that at all. Oh, good, thank you. So this morning, and thanks, Catherine, for putting up your disclosure slide. I have one too, and I wanted to share this with you because this is what a patient's disclosure slide might look like as opposed to an academic or a physician or a hospital administrator or a policymaker. Basically, I have the following disclosure to make. I've received honoraria from academic institutions, research care delivery organizations, government agencies, all across the continuum of care, and of course, various industry members. Now, let's be clear, I do not make a living wage from all of this activity. And in my black letter bold markings, this is really the key, core, central issue that speaks to my bias, and that is that I've spent in excess of $850,000 for prescription and over-the-counter drugs from over a dozen manufacturers over the last 39 years. And my rate of consumption at the price that my current biologic is now, I'm going to hit that $1 million mark in less than 16 months, just before I turn the age of 70. So if you're ever wondering what it is that influences my bias, it's not how much money I may get from industry, it's how much money I'm giving to industry. Vernon Law was a great baseball player in the 50s and 60s, and this quote is ascribed to him, that experience is a hard teacher because she gives the test first, the lesson afterwards. And that really speaks to what patient experience is all about. Today, I'm fighting a fog, which is really an immunosuppressant fog. I have a headache, which is kind of a migraine. I'm recovering from a bowel obstruction, and my heart rate is really elevated today. So if I'm really speaking fast, it's because I've got a 2-hour presentation I've got to condense into 15 minutes, and my heart isn't cooperating. I wanted to give a little bit of background to what the charity sector looks like, because that's where most of the patient groups actually operate in. So if you look at the Canadian landscape, you have 86,000 charities. You have $16 billion in donations, thereabouts. But here's a key statistic not often recognized, and that's that 60% of that $16 billion goes to only 1% of all those charities. The charity sector really represents 8.5% of our gross domestic product. And between the charity sector and the nonprofit sector, over 2.4 million people are employed. Under half of these organizations actually have paid staff. Yet, there's over 13 million volunteers, which represents 50% of all Canadians over the age of 15. And cumulatively, the aggregate is over 2 billion hours contributed, which is really also equivalent to about 1 million full-time jobs. What are some of the charity sector challenges? First of all, there is an ongoing constant rise in demand for services. It's never ending. Yet, over the last 15 years, there's been a changing pattern in donors, in how donors are responding. For instance, younger donors are giving less than they were 20 years ago. Millennials are looking at donations differently. Yet, surprisingly, new immigrants, new Canadians, give a higher percentage than they did 25 years ago. Overall, there are declining donor revenues. Charities are challenged to meet their mission objectives operationally, with human resources, in attracting the right kind of talent, retaining the right kind of talent, and of course, that 86,000 charity figure isn't static. It continues to grow, which means there's constant competition for the same sources of funding everybody's lining up in. Imagine Canada's chief economist has projected that by 2026, there will be a social deficit in the range of $24 billion if there's no change in policies reflecting how charities are financed. That's a pretty big number. How are we going to fill that gap? Well, let's put in the context where the health charities come in and really what their role in this is. So we've got, out of that 86,000, we've got over 4,600 health charities, and that includes patient groups, such as those represented here today and that we've been talking about in general, but also hospital foundations and social services as well. And this is almost 6% of all the charities in the country. I'd like to put things into historical perspective for a bit. I'm kind of reminded by Laurel and Hardy's great movie, A Fine Mess. And so in order to understand where we are today and what that mess is, I've got to look back a little bit to understand what brought us here. So there's a terrific book. You should all go out and read it. It's called Medieval Healthcare and the Rise of Charitable Institutions, The History of the Municipal Hospital. And this really gives us the context of where our entire approach to healthcare has really come. If you think about it, institutional healthcare really emerged out of religious doctrine. In both the Judeo and Christian tradition and history, and I'm afraid I'm ignorant of the Islamic and other traditions, but in our societal tradition, the care for the sick and needy really is a tenet of faith. So we're brought up and to believe that this is really part of our religion and our faith, not necessarily our society. And if we look at it over the centuries, there's been a unique partnership between Christianity and institutional care. All you have to do is look at all the hospitals called Saint something, and you'll recognize that. And this has really set the foundation for modern healthcare. So there's the principles of charity, the principles of volunteerism, and all of this really sets the framework. Okay. So here we are in 2019, and what are the very specific patient group challenges within this greater context of how our healthcare system has really evolved to look after the sick and the needy? First of all, staying true to the mission in the face of funding shortages can be tough, and decisions might be improperly taken, to be polite. How do you survive the Notre drought? Are there going to be mergers ad infinitum as revenues shrink, as missions need to be reassessed? What's going to happen? We've seen the biggest cancer organizations have to merge. We've seen some smaller cancer organizations merging. Is that going to be an ongoing, continuous trend? Accountability and transparency. Donors today want to know where their money is going to. They want to see concrete impact for their investment. There's a shift, and I think some of you may have seen that, where people are more ready to give to hospital foundations than to patient organizations simply because they can see that their money might be going to an MRI, or it might be going to a CT scan, it might be going to a building, something concrete that they can hold on to. Government cuts. Who ever heard of that happening in this world? And social service agencies are going to be the first to face that. People providing shelter, providing food, providing housing, transportation, looking after mental health associations. Government cuts are affecting everybody and forcing a greater realignment of where we need to apply our resources. Now, let's not forget that patient groups have also lost control of the narrative. Media relations suck. Let's face it. We haven't quite gotten control of what the narrative is, how the story gets out, what the story is supposed to be. The media's fascination, or so-called fascination, with the pharmaceutical industry, causes backsplash on patient groups, academics who are also, sort of focused on with an obsession on patient groups, then cause backsplash on patient groups. So how do we get control, regain control of the of the narrative, of the story? And then, of course, there's regulatory issues. Remember that you're working in a charitable environment, in the charity sector, and I mustn't forget that that's what's happening. Oftentimes when patient groups are so focused on granular activities, like changing the template of a patient input submission to CADA, we forget and ignore the realities of the bigger view of where the greater space of where we're operating. So how real and how impactful are things like restricted access to government grant and contribution programs? Charities don't get access to all the stuff that private companies might get that the government will support. There's a lack of access to sources of capital that private companies in the for-profit sector have that the charitable sector doesn't get. try to get, and just to prove that, try to go to your bank for your organization, ask for a loan to finance a particular program that you want to have, and see how successful you're going to be at that. There's a limit on nonpartisan political activities. I know that recently that there's been some changes in that, but if you haven't got money to do it, what's the point? And then, of course, there's political cycles. Really, you've got 4 years to get something done before something changes. And, do we have the capacity to react and respond and actually do that? For instance, we've taken a look, and Carly, here's a story for you, a really important story. Apparently, Ontario's provincial PFAC, Minister's PFAC, has been disbanded. All I can say is shame, but who's to shame? Who do we shame? How do we shame them? You could help with that. It's an important story. We no longer have a chair of that PFAC, and it's been disbanded. So some of the problem, what's the key problem, is how do we diversify the funding for the charity sector? How does funding become diversified for patient groups? How do we move from a state of volatility to a state of stability? How do you move from a state of dependency to a state of autonomy? And really, how do you move from being a charity, and how do we reframe and redefine that as a state of interdependence? And so I'm going to let Tanya Sermon interrupt this message. There's a Senate committee that is dedicated to the charity sector. They recently put out their report. They started hearings back in March of 2018. You should know that in the healthcare sector, out of that 4,900 charities, almost 6% of all the charities. Out of all the witnesses that appeared, there was only one witness from the health charity sector, and that was a representative from a small coalition of charities. There was almost 700 written submissions to the committee. Out of that 700, there was only one patient group that wrote in a submission. So let me tell you, there's stuff happening in Ottawa. There is now a permanent advisory committee, and on that permanent advisory committee, there are 15 members, none of which represent any healthcare charities or the healthcare sector at all whatsoever. So if we're going to take action, if patient groups really want to take action, are they sitting at the right table? Here's Tanya Sermon, a founder and CEO of the Center for Social Innovation, who speaks to the need and how and some of the things that need to be done structurally to begin to evolve some change. So take it away, Sonia.
And the problem is for-profits can't solve the problems that matter most. A private profit motive can't solve poverty. Assets that should be in the public and common good are left vulnerable to being bought and stripped. Building on the recommendations of the Social Innovation and Social Finance Co-Creation Group, which I have to say are motherhood issues, there's not a controversial one amongst them, I want to echo and be a little bit harder and tougher on this. First, as a social enterprise, please create a level playing field for social mission organizations. We should have equal access to the government supports that for-profits use. Our regulatory regime should unlock and enable, not create fear and trepidation. Second, the CRA absolutely needs to be modernized. It needed to be modernized 50 years ago. That said, please adopt a destination of funds test. Don't try to determine how we can and cannot make money. You have no idea where, and we have no idea where that money might occur. Focus on whether the money is going to serve our mission. Australia's done it, so can Canada. Third, support social enterprise and social innovation the way that you would support any sector that you want to see grow in Canada. Countless millions go into sophisticated for-profit innovation strategies. Imagine what we could do for our country and our communities with a little help for public benefit. Finally, and some people told me to take this out of my comments, but here you go. Please stop treating us as if we're breaking the law. The 2 million people who work in this sector across the country are smart, handle multiple bottom lines, and would sacrifice so much to serve our communities and our country. Please treat our sector with the respect that we have earned as professionals.
So, the question that remains now really is, thinking about what Tanya was saying, so much should have resonated for patient groups. And so, in reflection on that, I kind of think, are patient groups sitting at the right table? Are patient groups setting their targets in policy change in the right way? When we know that we've come from really a medieval background, a medieval foundation, are we really actually now operating in the right environment with the right kinds of tools and the right kinds of assets? The bake sale originated by homeless children waiting outside of bakeries to get contributions from customers leaving the bakery. Food is an essential element for all of us. We're not going to have health without food. And if we have to demand from patient groups that the best that they can do is a bake sale, are we really honoring the lived experience? Are we honoring the needs of our population? Are we even honoring the basic tenets of the foundations of our modern healthcare system, and that is to look after the sick and needy? Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much for that really powerful presentation. And now I'm pleased to invite our panel members up. We're going to have a quick question and answer session with the audience. So if you do have some questions, please get them ready. And we will be here for the next 20 or so minutes. There is a mic at the back, but you can also just raise your hands and we'll do it that way. So if we can all come up and grab some spaces here, and please get your questions ready. I think we're ready to go. Welcome. And then I'm happy to get the ball rolling, and then we'll open it up. So, one of the things we've heard a lot about is how this process of patient engagement can be improved, some of the challenges. The big question that I have is, as someone who's just watching it from the outside, is I sometimes can't believe how complicated it can be. We've heard some people talk about how you almost have to have this scientific approach to it. I'm wondering, is it time to maybe take a more patient-centered approach and kind of, blow up the way it's done currently when we talk about consultations and submissions, and really make it more patient-focused. Things like video submissions or just testimonials or things like that. So maybe I'll ask Helen, and then if anyone else wants to contribute, and then we can open it up.
Thank you. So thank you for that question. Certainly, I think one of the key pieces we're having as part of our proposal, which is looking at a reassessment process, right? So I think there's opportunities there to hear from the different folks, from patient groups, from industry, from our clinicians as well, what that process could look like. One of the things I think Jackie had really hit on is really some of the testimonials, right? So we often get the responses from surveys, which are really helpful because, again, it goes to some of the points that Catherine made around scientific evidence. But a lot of times, it's the actual anecdotes that really help support and contextualize the information for our expert review committee. And that's the types of information that's helpful. I can give you an example. I remember in one of our review where I think the idea was in the clinical information, it said that this product actually helped to decrease the spleen size by 2 centimeters, right? So the committee wasn't exactly impressed with that. It was actually what really helped propel and contextualize that information was the actual patient input and their experience in actually outlining what that means to them, what that means in their quality of life, what it means in terms of their day-to-day lived experience.
Thank you for that. Does anyone else want to jump in quickly before?
I just wanted to mention that a few years ago, the Macmillan Cancer Centre in London, England, gave a group, they formed a panel, like PERC, of a group of patients, caregivers and survivors, and asked them to decide on the allocation of a certain amount of funding. And the world didn't disappear overnight. They did a really good job, and I think that they'll repeat it again. But that's sort of turning everything on its head. Instead of having the experts, clinicians, and researchers and scientists make the decisions, they actually ask patients to make the decisions. And this apparently was a very successful experiment. So it goes to the fact that patients can be able to understand the technical language. But when we're talking about a submission from a patient group, at this point we're not expected to provide that information because it's already been provided by the manufacturer. So one thing that we try to do is make sure there's a ton of space on our surveys for comments, and sometimes we receive dozens of comments which we then pass on. I remember one particular drug where I think it was a prostate cancer drug, and the guy said, I had the worst side effects of any treatment I've ever had. And we in a very honest way, reported that. That was his experience. Others may not have had that many side effects, but we wanted to make sure that that got across, that not everything works well. We're all different, and so we try to be transparent in that. But expecting patient groups to actually provide the technical information would just ask us to do something that the manufacturers are doing much better than we could.
That's a great point. I'd like to open it up and see if there's any members of the audience who'd like to ask one of our panelists a question. Gentleman in the back. So perhaps if you can stand, and if we can't hear you, perhaps you can, or yeah, just maybe head back to the mic there. Got some. Just so everyone can hear, yeah.
For Helen, accepting that we have a very convoluted, complex drug system in Canada, and in light of the Health Canada R2D2 and the CADTH and DSIN and UP-DUIS reviews and the PMPRB new guidelines coming out this week, do you see any duplication of services there?
So thank you for that. And I think that's something we are working with. As you know, one of the key initiatives in terms of, you mentioned the R2D2 initiative, is our work with aligning some of the pre-NOC submissions, right? So whereby CADTH and Health Canada, as well as INES, are working closely in ensuring that the submissions are submitted in a timely manner. And in terms of that information is to allow us to share information amongst our organization to have a much more efficient process.
Anyone else have a question right off the bat?
I'll just talk if you can't hear me, let me know. So on July 1st, there was a new element of the PCODER process introduced to get feedback on a provisional algorithm, which is like a highly technical piece of information. And so from the patient group perspective, from your perspective, I would love comments on what you are hoping patients will be able to contribute in terms of feedback on the provisional algorithm.
So maybe perhaps I can start. So in terms of what we're hoping, it's really looking at the place of therapy of the new drug under review. And so what we're looking for from the patient group input is really the journey of the treatments, right? So it's the sequencing that we're looking at, because oftentimes patients will report on what some of their current treatments are. It's really to formalize that process and understand what that treatment really means, how the new treatment could actually impact the current treatments. So that's actually included as part of, in terms of, in our templates, we do ask that questions for patient groups to consider and to think about.
In our response, or in our submission, we've always, as part of the research, asked patients what treatments they are been on and what treatments they are on. And this presents some challenges sometimes because we have to inform ourselves of treatments for many different cancers depending on what the cancer is. What I would say is that this is probably one of the least answered questions that we have on our survey, and I think it's partly because some patients don't actually remember if they've been on many treatments. I mean, we deal a lot with metastatic patients who maybe have been on 6, 7, 8. In the case of a breast cancer patient who passed away about 10 years ago, she had been on 18 lines of treatment, including recycling some of the ones she started out with. So asking patients to provide information on all the treatments they've been on and then trying to get some kind of sequential information from them is, I think, going to prove difficult. There are patients who are really interested in everything about their treatment and want to get involved with organizations and want to become advocates. There are other patients who want their cancer to be treated and go home and try and get back to their normal lives. I mean, we're talking about, what, over 200,000 people, Canadians every year being diagnosed with cancer. So there's great variation in still. And if we think of some of the social determinants of health, which we haven't talked about at all, there may be a fairly large number of those over 200,000 people who are not very literate or have low literacy levels. And we try and make our surveys as readable as possible, but when you start listing off treatments, there's often not an easy way to do that. So we do have a fair number of patients who just absolutely skip that part, and other parts that have to do with understanding, giving us information about what treatments they've been on. So that's something that we have to look at. The issues are that people don't sometimes know or remember, or they've been too ill to keep track.
Thank you for that. And we have a question at the back.
Good morning, thank you all. Curious, Catherine, you were mentioning about patient input, possibly the opportunity for it to be more scientific, and that intrigued me simply because, you know, when we talk about patient values, regurgitation of the clinical packages of what we submit is not favored. If anything, we encourage people to talk about real lived experience and what this drug means to them from a patient perspective and a caregiver perspective. So I was just intrigued by that comment and wondered if you could clarify that a bit more.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Is this working okay? Can you hear me?
Yep.
I think it's a really important question because my takeaway from this research is not that patient groups need to or should become, engaged in rigorous qualitative research on their own communities. I don't think it's a terribly reasonable expectation, and like you said, regurgitating the product monograph is not. It's frowned upon by the committee, and it's not terribly useful. So I think what this finding points to about the way technical members talk about what counts as evidence and how do we understand patient admissions, right? How do we evaluate them? I think what it really points to is a need for more dialogue about what those standards are, about what patient input is supposed to do, and what good patient input, good, is for the purposes of the committee, because the way that most technical members, and not all, but many technical members understand evidence has to do with years and years of training in, valuing a particular type of information. And so I think sometimes we forget that, they're human too. You can't just put an entirely new type of information in front of them and say, okay, take this into account and use it the same way you use the information that you're familiar with. Now, it's been more than 10 years since public and patient involvement was introduced. I think it's reasonable to expect progress on these kinds of discussions, but I think there is, this research, anyway, to me, still suggests there's a gap in how different players in the drug assessment process understand patient submissions particularly.
Zal, I just wanted to ask you really quickly, because you'd had, your perspective as a patient and the work that you do really speaks to a lot of the challenges and issues. And I just was wondering if there are some things that you would say, some high level or just really ground level things that, could be changed to make things work a lot easier and more seamlessly for groups.
Well, I probably have about 80,000 suggestions, and they're all high level, but I want to focus on two. And one of them has to do with pain and suffering. And listening to what Catherine just said, the technical assessment generally does not measure pain, doesn't measure anguish, doesn't measure the suffering that people go through. So how is that experience conveyed in an assessment? And how do people make sense of some things that are really contradictory? For instance, the fact that people will undergo great pain, will endure great pain if the outcome is right. I'm going to demonstrate that to you right now. A gentleman in the room, have any of you had or born children? No hands, okay. Ladies in the room, have any of you had a child, given birth to a child? Okay. All right, did anybody, before you had that child, before you gave birth, did anybody tell you what the experience was going to be like? How much pain you might have to endure? Did anybody tell you that? Raise your hands if anybody told you that. Oh boy, we actually had some people tell you that. Okay, now even though that you knew that, you went ahead with it. How many of you then went ahead with it a second time? Or a third time? So how do you speak to, particular training, technical training, you've got particular ways of thinking. How do you cross that barrier? One of the ways, obviously, is through storytelling. I mean, stories are the way we communicate. We've been doing that for thousands of years, from the days of the caveman with the, carvings on the wall. But we have far more sophisticated tools and media resources now that will allow us to convey the lived experience through the narrative lived experience in altogether different ways. Everybody's got a story. Everybody loves to tell their story, and believe it or not, people feel better after having told their story. And that's often a misconception. How we take that story, move it into the drug assessment process, the whole HTA process, is still a work in progress. And I think that as we learn how to embed the lived experience into the DNA of HTA, we're going to discover that patients are actually going to become a greater part of the process from the beginning to the end, and not just at the singular point of patient input and the singular submission, but rather they'll be participating and involved right from, as you're referring to in terms of public and patient participation and involvement, but right from when the question is developed for a clinical trial, right through to the final reimbursement decision. So getting that story, building on that story, eliminating all of the duplication of that story. Let's face it, the burden of illness, for every particular illness is generally the same, and then you got. So why are patient groups forced to repeat and constantly for every submission what that burden of illness is? How do we understand that burden of illness in a new way and train and teach and inform our technical experts in that. So that's the first thing we do. The second thing we need to do is to take a look at a very high level and say, are we looking the entire space in the right way? We've looked, we have universal health care in this country. Okay, I'm going to put it in quotes, we have universal health care. But again, it's predicated upon the principle of providing for the sick and the needy. And we've taken it not just from, we've taken it from a religious tenet to, and doctrine, but to a basic value of our society. So it's no longer a religious thing, it's a societal thing. So when we talk about the systemic challenges that patient groups are faced with, funding, capacity, human resources, et cetera, how are we going to take a look at that if we're moving from charity to independence? If we're going to take a look and we're saying this is now a societal value, should we be taking the patient out of the individual silos that they are in right now, which is 4,900 different charities, not including all the nonprofits, which are about equal, to tell you the truth. And how do we take that and put that right into Health Canada, right into the government, and how do we enshrine it? How do we enshrine the patient experience into our government process right from the very top? That, there are some examples for that. And if you look at the Canadian Medical Protective Association and wonder, how did they get legislation enacted 100 years ago to establish and fund that association? I mean, doctors had it right. They figured it out 100 years ago. It's taking patients a little bit of time to catch up.
That's fantastic. And I think that's a really great point to wrap things up at for this part of the morning. So what we'll do now is we'll have about a 15-minute break, so everyone can just go grab a coffee or a breath of fresh air. And we're going to meet back here, and of course we'll all be around if to answer any questions offline, off the stage. So thank you all. Thanks to the panelists for contributing, and looking forward to the next part. Thank you, guys. Thank you all very much. Perfect. Okay. And we'll just chat when it's wrapped up. Like, it's not, yeah, that'll be great. Okay. All right. So it was nice to have a little coffee break. And before long, we'll be having some lunch. And everyone can continue our conversations. So we're going to shift a little bit. The next part of our discussion is going to look at pharmacare. This is the big one. One that we're all watching very anxiously, and I know we've been talking about this seemingly, for decades now, so, but the conversation continues to evolve, and actually we're seeing some positive steps forward, so we'll see where things go with the next, obviously, election campaign. And that's what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about first, before we bring up our first speaker, just to talk a little bit about where things are at with pharmacare and the discussion around the election and where things go from here. So, we know this. All major parties, except for the Conservatives, have said that they're committed to some form of a pharmacare program. So those programs would differ depending on, who forms the next government. As far as the federal Conservatives go, the things that they have said are basically that we have a great system already, that we just need to fill in some of the gaps, so that we're, they're still saying that they're committed to ensuring that people are getting access to the medications they need, but that this universal payer system is not necessarily the solution. And as most of us are probably aware, the federal Liberals and the federal NDP have endorsed and backed a program that would be along the lines of a universal single payer system. And this follows the release of the Advisory Council report over the summer, which did recommend this to move forward as the best way and the best system. But let's not forget, obviously, it's still a long and bumpy road from the report to implementation, and there's still some question marks around whether or not pharmacare ever will be a reality, depending on who forms the government. And even if a party that does endorse it forms a government, will we see it then? So there's still a lot that we don't know. And then we have the added wrinkle of some provinces saying that they might not want to partake in a national program. And so there's still, just a lot of questions, what the realities of this program would look like, what would the sort of medicine list be, the essential medicines list look like, and how comprehensive will things be. But regardless of what the options are, the proponents of pharmacare have the same basic goal in mind, and that is to ensure that patients have access to medications without having to go into debt or even bankruptcy, which, we obviously hear these horror stories of families that have to make these terrible decisions between buying groceries or medicine, or basically filing for bankruptcy, or not even being able to afford medication for their children. During the advisory council consultation period, and this is something we'll be hearing more about shortly, they did ask thousands of Canadians their opinions on what we should look for stepping forward with a government-funded pharmacare program. And there were some concerns expressed by some individuals that a pharmacare program could threaten their coverage. It could leave them worse off than they were before. A lot of people say that they have a great program currently and they don't want to see the government sort of step in and take some of their medicines away. That basically what we need is a public, private, or a private system that is enhanced to ensure that people don't fall through the cracks, that vulnerable people have the access to what they need. And it's important to note that some of the concerns about this lost coverage also are coming from the industry side. So we've heard, for instance, from Innovative Medicines Canada, which represents many pharmaceutical companies. They have said that a universal single-payer system could make it difficult for some patients to access their drugs, even if for instance, if those medications aren't covered under the universal system. There's also the argument that research and innovation could be driven from Canada because of this, onerous, costly, and otherwise inefficient system. So those are some of the concerns that have been raised. Insurance companies and other associations have also echoed those concerns. Drug policy experts, on the other hand, point to the experience of other countries. The United Kingdom is often cited as an example of how things can work. They say Canada is one of the only high-income developed countries without a universal drug plan, and that other countries show that not only do these systems work, they can save billions of dollars a year. For instance, a universal program can help Canada increase its bargaining power. So instead of tons of little programs sort of negotiating with drug companies, you have one big organization, one country with the clout that it has to negotiate lower and better prices for patients. Research has shown that in a year, nearly 500,000 Canadians who can't afford their medication will end up using extra hospital or medical services that cost the healthcare system money, extra money that they didn't need to cost, and this obviously adds a significant burden. Steve Morgan, he's a drug policy expert who's become sort of one of the leading voices of advocating for a national pharmacare system. He has noted that in the UK, the pharmacare system provides better access to prescription drugs than we have here in Canada, and it costs 40% less per capita, and that the country has actually been able to attract 5 times of the research and development dollars than it actually spends, so 5 times per every dollar it spends. So as we noted, the road from the Advisory Council report to implementation will be long, bumpy, perhaps even treacherous. Many Canadians are hoping that the next government can make this a reality because, we've heard many times from people who, as we say, have just encountered so many barriers in the way the current system is set up. And one of the challenges will obviously be getting enough input from Canadians on what this system will look like. So the Advisory Council had thousands of Canadians and groups telling them what they want, and now we need to see how this system should be shaped if and when it does become a reality. And so it will be really key to get a lot of different voices into that process, and how that is done and who is consulted will obviously be of huge interest and of huge importance. It will be, just as we talked about with the drug submission process, it's really critical to get a range of voices and a range of perspectives in to ensure that people, it's the people who can't afford those medications that maybe have that voice, the people who would be impacted the most by such programs, and making sure that we do hear from all of those different groups. So we really need to have it's critical to ensure that that balance is met, and that, this is basically a huge generational shift in the way our healthcare system is run. And so, hopefully when and if it happens, we can get it right. And so I'm going to kick things off by introducing our next speaker, who's going to walk us through all of this and more. And so we will introduce the Honourable Diana Whelan, who was the Deputy Premier of Nova Scotia from 2013 to 2017. She was first elected to the Nova Scotia House of Assembly for Halifax Clayton Park in 2003, and she was re-elected in 2006, 2009, and again in 2013. And from 2013 to 2015, she served as Nova Scotia's Minister of Finance and Treasury Board, the Minister responsible for the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation, and the Minister responsible for the Utility and Review Board Act. She later served as the Minister of Justice and Attorney General from 2015 to 2017, and recently she was the Interim Vice President of Administration at Mount St. Vincent University. Ms. Whelan holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Master's in Business Administration from Dalhousie University and is a Chartered Professional Accountant. So please welcome to the stage.
Well, thank you so very much. I think I'll just get familiar with this as well. See, there you go, first slide. On the slide, you'll see the cover of the report that was done by the Advisory Council on the implementation of National Pharmacare. And throughout our consultation over the last year, from June 18 until the report came out in June of 19, we stressed the word implementation. It was said from the moment that the council was formed that there's been a lot of studies done on the need for National Pharmacare. And I haven't put a lot in my slides because of the 15 minutes that we are to take, but the need has been well documented. The confusion and fragmentation of our system that we currently have has been well documented. So the government asked a council to come forward and help on the implementation, looking at a plan for just that. In doing so, you'd be familiar with Dr. Eric Hoskins. He was the chair of our group. He was appointed in February of 2018 when it was announced in the federal budget that there would be money made available for an implementation group to come together. In June of that same year, Eric had been working on this for a few months. We were then announced 6 other members of that advisory council. And I would be very remiss if I didn't say that in addition to the council itself, we had a secretariat in Ottawa that was put together by the government. About 20 people were on that, pharmacists, financial people, health administrators, senior people from both health and finance who make up that secretariat that supported our work. And that was very, very important because there was so much to be done. We covered I'll talk about consultation, but we did a lot of work and we needed a lot of support because we came from every corner of the country. As mentioned, my home is Nova Scotia, so we had people from across the country. You may be familiar, I'm certainly sure that some of you are familiar with Eric Hoskins, who was health minister here, but we also had Camille Orridge, who is well known in health circles here in Ontario as well. And I wanted to specifically, because of the content of today's talk, point out that in our coming together, we also had Vincent Dumez, and Vincent is the co-director of the Centre of Excellence for Partnerships with Patients and the Public at the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Montreal. He's been a patient his whole life and an advocate and worked in many different capacities, but he definitely was essential to have on our team, and that was recognized by the people who put together the 7-member council. So Vincent was a big voice for patients there and keeping it front and center. Camille Orridge has worked a lot in Toronto and in underserved areas with more stresses and vulnerability, and she kept us aware all the way through about patients who don't have either has been mentioned, language abilities, might be new Canadians, people without the capacity to navigate our system and understand. So we kept that front and center as well. So as I mentioned, we were formed in June of 2018. We were told that our report had to be done within 1 year because we were going to cease to exist as a council. And so I come to you today as a former member of that council. I am not acting in any official capacity now, but hopefully leveraging some of the many lessons that I've learned over the last year. So implementation was key, and when we were appointed, we were really instructed to have no preconceived path in mind. We had to be open-minded and head off to do our consultation and keep that open-minded approach. One of the things I'm really proud of in the report that we put together is and if you've looked at the report, and I hope some of you have, it is public, is that throughout it has stories that are patients' perspectives. And they're just interspersed throughout the report. There'll a picture and a story in the patient's own words. And just because, as I think was said in the question and answer, the context is so important. You could say 1 in 5 Canadians can't afford their drugs or are trading off food for medicine or cutting their pills in half or not taking their drugs appropriately or simply not filling prescriptions. But when you read the stories of people and their struggles to get access to their drugs and to be able to stay healthy, it's really quite, I think it brings it home for everybody. So that was a really positive thing. The stories that were there were gathered from a person who actually lives in Nova Scotia, and he's on his own, just a private person, has created a Facebook and I think a website called Faces of Pharmacare, where he does just that, documents and gathers people's stories. And I thought that was really, really important. So our mandate was to give independent advice to 2 ministers, the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Health, in a manner that is affordable for Canadians, their families, employers, and government. So you can see finance was a part of it, as well as looking at the health aspects of this. So it was, a tall order and 1 year of fast time. I wanted to focus on consultation again because of our emphasis today, but it was important, and we needed a lot of logistics and coordination to do this. But in that period of consultation, we did hear from over 32,000 Canadians, and that split up. And actually, I'm wondering, has anybody here attended any of the roundtables that we did? We did a number of roundtables in Ontario. Yeah, so 1 anyway, maybe a few others that aren't putting their hand up. But we did have, I thought, and this actually goes back to how we do consultation, because we talked about, I think it was, now I'm forgetting which country it was, but that other places are looking at mixed groups to start the discussion. Our groups of roundtables had people from all stakeholder groups. We had industry people there from the benefits industry, insurance, pharmaceutical, chambers of commerce, groups that would care a lot about the financing of a pharmacare, but also patients groups, patients themselves, all of the medical professions, from dentistry, nurse practitioners, pharmacists, the whole gamut, and many more. So we had a great cross-section in each one of those sessions, and we had 16 of the regional roundtables that happened in every province. And we also had a discussion paper that went out online and received 15,000 questionnaires that were returned after the discussion paper went with the questionnaire. 1,400 other comments were received, and written submissions, which came in later, we had 150 of those, again, from big industry players as well as from individuals. So that came from anybody. We also heard from people who had petitions and letter writing campaigns we had 3 town halls, so that we just had open sessions. That was Halifax, Toronto, and Vancouver. And we really tried to reach out in every way possible to hear from people. When I go to the roundtables, I should say our very first meeting was here at the Kadath offices. We used your boardroom to meet. And in getting together in that first time, when we came together to outline what we were going to do on that first meeting, we had a session with patients first, and in the afternoon with patient advocates, so advocate groups. And that was really at the insistence of Dr. Hoskins, who was our chair, who said that we needed to keep the idea of what are we doing this for, and what's the need, and we needed to keep the patient voice very clearly in our minds. And for me, it was new, so that was really important because it helped to frame it for me, and I'm sure for the other members of the group. So, as I say, there were a lot of different ways that we connected with the public and with patients, and we tried to keep that very, very central. And mixing those groups in the round tables was really good, because we were asking 3 questions of everybody at the group, and we recorded and took notes from each table to record back. But the 3 questions that were standard everywhere was: who should be covered, then what should be covered, because the formulary, as you mentioned, Carly, are very important. What should be covered? And finally, who pays, which is really often the big stumper. People were pretty agreed on who. It should be a wide number of people or everybody. What? We should have a wide number of drugs. Who pays becomes one that would sort of bring everybody up to a little bit of a, I wouldn't say a standstill, but more thought had to go into that. So, you know, we did a lot of commissioning of research as well about where are the gaps, who are we missing in that, and we reached out specially as well in 2 different sessions, one in Toronto, one in Halifax, on who are the underinsured. What we realized was even though we started our discussions with a group of patients in a room, we realized that the people who could afford to be there, both from resource of availability, time, their needs about being caregivers and so on, meant that they were a more privileged group. No question. Even though they had a valid voice about being patients and so on, we knew there are other people who can't take time off work because they're not paid if they come to our round table, or they're going to, they're going to simply be too stressed to come. So we thought, how do we hear from them? And we reached out very especially to find people that a representative group of people that we could pay an honorarium to and have them come and meet us. And we were able to do that in 2 locations. And I think that was really important because that really does represent another group. And we were trying to understand better underinsured and uninsured perspectives. And so I think that was really, really important. The mixed group, I've gone over that, good. So I don't want to take too long on that, but I wanted you to get the sense of how thorough we intended to be and tried to be. So what did we learn? Just quickly, we are the only country in the world with universal health care that doesn't cover or have available a national pharmaceutical plan. So not one of, but the only one. So that's not a good thing. We have the 3rd highest prices for drugs in the OECD. Only the US and Switzerland are higher, and I point out they have very big pharmaceutical industries. It's a big economic player in both those countries. We found really significant gaps in coverage across the country. We also, in that consultative period, as we went to each provincial capital, we met with the government officials that run pharmacare programs so that we could understand in each province what are they doing. And we went to the territories as well. So what are they doing, and what do they offer to their people? And as you know, this is really important. It's a provincial matter. So whatever the federal government hopes to do in way of pharmacare requires provincial buy-in. And that really needs to be laid out, almost it should be my first slide, that we were an advisory board put together to provide advice, and we know that the government has only limited tools to make this happen. If the provinces aren't interested, it won't happen at all. So we wanted to understand every provincial plan and how they work and what's offered, and we found a huge variety in terms of what's available. There are over 100 public plans in the country. So the federal government as well has public plans for people who are in jail, for the First Nations people, for veterans and armed services. So they run their own plans. So do each of the provinces set up different plans, and the territories too. So it's very, very fractured. Each one has to negotiate prices finally for every drug. Even though there's a complex system of approval and advice, they go off at the end of the day individually to decide whether they're going to list a drug and how to go about doing it. So that whole system of approvals and ultimately listing a drug on a public plan is very convoluted and too slow, I would think patients would agree. And so there's work to be done there. So this is sort of some of the highlights of what we discovered. The eligibility I have there on the public plans can be broad or targeted. We found some provinces had very few plans. Everybody joins the plan that they have. I'm thinking BC has perhaps only one, and it's done not by income. You pay a different amount based on your income, but you have one plan. Whether you're senior or you're 30 years old, you join the same plan. I was mentioning to somebody just before on the break that in Nova Scotia, the seniors pharmacare plan is sacred. I mean, I don't know how you'd get rid of the seniors pharmacare plan because seniors value it so much and it's just, you don't touch it. So I was quite impressed that they had one plan and seniors would be part of it. You'd have the option to join the same plan as a younger person. When we looked at gaps in this current system, we found that probably the most vulnerable group are young people. We talk so much about seniors and their need for drugs, and certainly they need more drugs and are prescribed more drugs. But young people have very vulnerable work now. There's a changing nature in our work world. More people on contract. I know when I think of my own family, I have a daughter who works on contract, no benefits whatsoever. So that's happening a lot. So I think you can understand that we think there's a very big changing nature of work that makes, depending on employer plans, less reliable, and probably that will continue, and our public plans become ever more important. And also, we found a huge increase in the price of drugs, which I'll get to in a little while. But that's just the nature of it. Drug prices are rising. We also, and I don't have a slide on it, but I think it's important to look quickly at the history of drugs and drug plans. I'm going to watch my time. But we're really seeing a parallel between the introduction of universal health care that we have in Canada, which came in after the Hall Commission in the 1960s. That report recommended that pharmacare or pharmaceuticals be part of the coverage. But there was so much controversy and so much political, I suppose, compromise going on at the time that pharmacare was put aside. And it wasn't as big an issue then because the cost of drugs wasn't as large. There were not the kind of wonderful, and we really do have wonderful treatments coming on board and new drugs that are doing great things, but they cost a lot. At the time in the 1960s, there was kind of a basket of drugs that were quite commonly used and not terribly expensive and not as broad as what we have today. So it was a different world, and it was put aside for another day, and we're here 50 years later looking at national pharmacare. So, and it has been looked at and recommended, over that period of time. So I think the time now is a good time to be looking at it. This is the Gantt chart, or the sort of implementation chart that was in the report and is in the report. It shows a two-phase recommendation, and I think the important thing is it can't happen overnight. And those of you who work at CADTH and understand about the complexity of what we have today, it will be a big job to move towards a national pharmacare. But the very first line is around the provinces and territories having to deliver national pharmacare. Our recommendation is they continue to deliver what they're doing, and that national pharmacare would be an incremental or improvement, province by province, and the federal government would be responsible for the incremental cost, the final cost. So the top one is negotiating and legislating with the provinces. The next line is the Canadian Drug Agency being created. So one of our main recommendations is that we take some of the different organizations and pieces that are in place in Canada around our regulatory approvals and put it under one umbrella and have a Canadian Drug Agency. And so that needs to have a lot of study in how it can be and which pieces fit in. And would it be Health Canada, for example, who do the original approval of a drug for safety? Are they part of it, or do they still do their thing and then it goes into another realm for efficacy and so on? So the work of CADTH, the PMPRB, which is the Patented Medicines Review Board, and the Pan-Canadian Pricing Alliance, PCPA, and there's others that need to be looked at. But what to do there? So that needs to be studied, and that we say up to 2022 it would be looked at and hopefully launched at that point. The third one is the actual development of a national formulary, which is the list of all the drugs needed, or that the government would be putting on that national formulary list so that you also would deal with the great disparity between provinces. I talked about costs, co-pays, deductibles, financial obligation differing so much, even eligibility from province to province. But we also have a huge difference in the formularies. They vary from 4,000 drugs to 8,000 on provincial formularies. So we have to look at, how do we go forward and what goes on those formulary lists. And our suggestion is that we begin with an essential medicines list. The World Health Organization has a list of about 250 drugs, I think, that they have in a category like that. That doesn't mean that we would take them all, because they have drugs like malarial drugs that we probably wouldn't see as essential in Canada. But to come up with a list of perhaps about 150 drugs that would be, we were told that would cover over 50% or around 50% of the prescriptions written. And these tend to be the common drugs, the less expensive drugs, the more frequently prescribed drugs. And then in the subsequent years after 2020, we see the next 5 years being devoted to creating a more comprehensive national formulary list, which hopefully would be in place and be able to kick off in 2027. And that, again, requires looking at each drug and having an agency that could assess each drug and negotiate prices for each drug before you can get it on the list. So, it's ambitious. As it says, it can't happen overnight, so we have to be able to approach it in a methodical way. The final piece, which I think is really important, and we heard this so often across the country, was the need for a strategy and an approach to expensive drugs for rare diseases. And one of the problems that comes up in this one is that individually in provinces and I suppose nationally for CADTH, there aren't enough patients to create a scientific pool, I guess would be the right word, to mimic the kind of studies that we would do for a more common disease, where you can have test really many people and test a drug in a wider pool. So you need a different approach. If the drug looks promising and indications are that it would help people, we can't be immobilized because the same sort of testing can't be done. So we want to have the experts come together and look at a different way of managing the demand for those drugs that are very promising and yet haven't been reaching patients. So and I think that there'd be a lot of support for that provincially, because those expensive drugs for rare diseases, we often have only a few in a province. And I think of Fabry's disease in Nova Scotia. It's sort of the center. We have more people with Fabry's in Nova Scotia than all the other provinces combined, and it's too much of a burden. When a drug became available for Fabry's, Nova Scotia was really overwhelmed. They wanted to provide it, but they didn't have the money and so on. And it was an example of a first drug where just by itself there was a national approach to Fabry's disease. But we don't want to have a whole lot of one-offs. We want to have a system and actually a strategy for that. So that, in a nutshell, is the recommendation when you see how we expect to see that roll out. Eligibility, the recommendation, and I stress again, this is a recommendation for universal coverage, so it would be aligned with Medicare. If you're a resident of Canada, you have a health card, you would go to your pharmacy and you would have your drug covered, provided it's on the national formulary. So it would be the same thing. Nobody would ask you what you earn. Nobody will ask you what your job is or whether you have coverage at work and so on. It would simply be that you're a Canadian resident. The formulary, which it would be envisioned, and it's in the report saying comprehensive evidence-based list of products for common conditions and more complex illnesses. And we've talked about mental health and physical health as well, and pediatric, because there's a lack of I'm told there's a lack of studies on pediatric drugs and the different way that they interact with children. So we talked about pediatric being a special need area, and any of the drugs or treatments needed for LGBTQ as well. We wanted to talk about cost, and cost is definitely a big issue, but promoting generic and biosimilar substitution will be an important part of controlling costs, so that there are recommendations to that effect. And again, I talked about the two-step process about bringing it in, starting with essential medicines. The co-pays, we had a lot of discussion about whether there should be any co-pays, because there are studies and evidence from around the world that even a small co-pay can be a deterrent for some people in filling their drug needs. So we did go with a very small one, $2 for essential medicines, $5 for the others for each prescription, and a maximum of $100 for a household in a year. Because if you had it per person, you could end up with, a big bill for some people that are very marginalized. Also, the role of private insurance is really important. We did suggest that it remain available for supplemental coverage, because there will be drugs, and I know that will be questions on people's minds here, drugs that aren't on the formulary, or perhaps people are waiting for them to come on the formulary, and if you have access to private coverage, you could have those drugs covered. So there has to be a role, I think, still for private coverage, and it will remain in there, and we certainly left the door open. I think it's interesting just quickly to note, though, we did consultation with 4 other countries. We had conference calls with New Zealand, Australia, Netherlands, and the US. And in New Zealand, you are able to get supplemental private private benefit coverage for pharmaceuticals, and only 5% of the people in New Zealand access that, bother with it. I don't know why that is. It says to me that they're pretty happy with what they're getting through the national plan, but I thought that was an interesting stat. And they didn't explain it. They simply said only 5% of New Zealanders take the opportunity to get private coverage. So, if we do nothing, am I at the cost yet? No, I'm at the core elements. We'll go to the cost. Cost, because my time is short. You'll have to wave at me, maybe. On this one, I just wanted to quickly go into it because it was one of the points that I was asked to touch on. And under the status quo, if we just choose to do nothing, and this is what Canadians have done up to now, just kept putting this off, the costs are rising very, very fast, and they're rising because of the amazing advances in pharmaceuticals. You know, having not biosimilar, but having new categories and classes of drugs and so on are just pushing the price up. So currently we're around $30 billion a year. This one says after rebates, $28 billion, I think comes out of the report. But by the year 2027, when we hope to, if this plan were to unfold, we'd be at full pharmacare, the cost of doing nothing will be $52 billion. And that's just because there are so many increased pressures on costs. That is split pretty much, not evenly, it's more public than private, but it's split between public, private, and out-of-pocket. In our current, you might be interested to know, currently Canadians, out of the $30 billion that we pay, about $5 billion is out-of-pocket, so people not covered at all and digging into their pockets to find the money. So that's one. Costs are rising, as I say, and threatening sustainability not only of the provincial plans, which I actually hope will help the provinces to be more interested, and as we went to see health ministers and health departments, they were cautiously interested and optimistic, and I think it's because they're seeing this huge pressure and change in the last number of years in the costs of their plans. But I want to make the point that it's also putting a lot of stress on employer plans, and the groups that we met with, and we did meet with Chambers of Commerce and business groups, they want to provide this benefit to their employees, but they're finding it increasingly difficult. And if you're a small pool and don't have thousands of employees, you only have a few hundred, the stress is really great. If you have one person in your plan that has one of the illnesses that might be enormously expensive or be a chronic disease that requires an expensive drug, that becomes very hard for those plans. And we're seeing that they're changing their co-pays, they're adding lifetime maximums or annual maximums, things that will control their costs and limit access to drugs for their employees. So with pharmacare, I say we can address the challenge of our high cost of pharmaceuticals in comparison to other nations. The one figure in particular that struck me was the UK, and it was mentioned earlier that they're cheaper. We pay about $900 per person for drugs with all 3 payers, public, private, and out-of-pocket. In the UK, it's $600 per person. So there's something out of whack in Canada, and we need a drug agency to find out what. But we're hoping that a Canadian drug agency would coordinate our efforts, make us stronger in negotiating, be a stronger voice nationally, and just also provide a lot of other benefits, which there isn't time to go into today, but things like deprescribing drugs that aren't working well, or changing finding out which ones have adverse effects. We don't even have a good system for going back to patients who have drugs that have adverse effects that are discovered. I think we do much better with our cars and the car recalls than we do with pharmaceuticals. And it's because we don't have a national database and a good access to information. So that's very, very important to us. So what other costs? That's really the critical part, I think. There's a lot to it. You may have more questions afterwards. The fundamental steps that have already begun, and that is that we have, we did an interim report in February, and the federal government did announce some foundational pieces, which I think are really important as we go forward, regardless of what happens in this election or how bold or the approach is, I don't want to say bold, but whatever approach different parties may take, we need to have that better coordination between provinces and territories. We need a national, I think, database and better, stronger IT services so that we can have information. And so all of that are part of the building blocks. And the federal government agreed in this year's budget to create a Canadian Drug Agency. They put in $35 million over 4 years for a transitional office, which will be made up again of people in Ottawa from health and finance to create the foundation of a Canadian Drug Agency. So I think we need that regardless. And to develop an evidence-based national formulary, they've identified that, and to start work on the rare diseases, which is going to be needed regardless of where else they go. For the rare diseases, I must say the money advocated or allocated is $1 billion over 2 years, so that's $500 million a year, in 2022 and 23, and continuing on at $500 million a year, which is lots of money, but it's a few years out, so it doesn't start immediately. And as a former finance minister, I know that means it's somewhat uncertain. But the final one would be going back to patients and their importance. There are a lot of recommendations in our report that speak to patients. And first off, the Canadian Drug Agency, which is an aspirational vision of this report, includes patients. It says you must have patients on the board that manages that agency or as it goes forward. In the report, we talk about the need for a true partnership between patients and the healthcare system that is going to be critical to the success and decision-making that is part of an upcoming national pharmacare. The council recommends, all of the council recommendations around governance and implementation talk about strong patient partnerships. So how to do that, we're going to have to find those mechanisms that work, because we've heard here today from others that we've got to really fine-tune and maybe turn on our head how we bring in patient voices. But one of the other things I thought was very important was speeding up the access to innovative medicines. That's recommendation 58. It's a recommendation to streamline and modernize drug reviews for faster access to innovative medicines. I think that's a good point to stop on, and I really do thank you for inviting me and being able to give just a snapshot of the work of the Advisory Council. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yes, it was a snapshot, but a really informative one, because this is a huge area, so well done in just a couple of minutes. So next up, I'm going to introduce Dr. Monica Slovenik D'Angelo, who is a health psychologist with extensive national and international experience leading, developing, implementing, and evaluating health intervention programs, healthcare delivery models, and strategic health initiatives at organizational and system levels. In her current role as Director of the Health Portfolio at the Conference Board of Canada, she leads research and convening programs that address pertinent design, implementation, and policy issues in the areas of health system transformation, workplace health and safety, and chronic health condition prevention and management. So please welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for having me here. Maybe I'll go straight to the next slide, and as with everybody else, there we go. So I represent the Conference Board of Canada. We are, many of you may be familiar with our work, but we are a nonpartisan, independent, evidence-based research organization. And some of the information, or actually all of the information I'll be presenting today, represents the research that we have completed in the area. And actually, it builds on everything else that was said today by my colleagues, so I think it'll be good. Just to give you a quick overview in terms of the work that we do in the health portfolio of the Conference Board, and so you can see how our work on pharmacare and healthcare transformation fits in within the broader context. We have, I would say, the area is divided, although there are close interrelationships between workplace health and safety, and healthcare and health policy. And on the workplace health side, there's a large focus on mental health, chronic disease prevention and management in the workplace. And the patient experience is more and more catching on as a relevant factor for employers to consider, when they consider the benefits that they offer to their employees and programs that they launch or institute to improve the employee health, which then in turn impacts on employee productivity. And so again, the employee experience is almost analogous to the a patient experience, and so we're seeing that across the board. The voice of the individual is being sought out. And then in the healthcare and health policy space, we launched, because it's relevant to the conversation or to the presentation by Honorable Diana Whelan that we just heard, we launched the National Pharmacare Initiative in 2018, and that was intended to facilitate some discussions, bring together stakeholders alongside the work that was conducted by the Advisory Council. And this initiative, the National Pharmacare Initiative, ended, or I should say our work concluded, although we will continue to work in the space, with a summit of the National Pharmacare Initiative last November, where we brought together patient representatives, representatives from industry, so public and private sectors, and clinicians. So we heard kind of a varied perspective on where people felt or feel that decisions should go. So I'll present some of our findings from those conversations as well. I will also mention, and I'll speak to at the very end of my presentation, is that patient access to health care is a key area of focus for us now in research, and our key strategic initiative in health is Value-Based Healthcare Canada, which is an initiative that value-based healthcare with some resonates, with others the terminology not so much, but it's an approach to healthcare transformation that focuses on the patient perspective, the patient voice, really focusing on outcomes that are meaningful to patients, and also focuses on bringing efficiencies into the system. But I'll speak to more of that later. So I kind of structured, the information based on some of the questions that I think are relevant to the audience here. And so in terms of implications of a universal single-payer public pharmacare system, I will not repeat any of the information that was just presented, but what I can speak to some of the evidence that came out from some of the reports that we had, either seconded or some of our own research. So, indeed, improved access or a universal plan would improve access to medicines for Canadians across the country, and it would provide consistent and portable coverage. I think some of the questions that that keep coming up are those, and again they were addressed in the earlier presentations, but they're around reduced access to private insurance. So, while we want to ensure that there's equity in terms of patient access to pharmaceuticals, to pharmaceutical treatments, we also want to ensure that those that are receiving a certain level of treatments are not, that their access is not reduced in order to achieve that equity. So that's just something important to keep in mind. There's also the question and concern of those people who currently do receive benefits through their employers that typically actually do cover a more extensive access to active ingredients and cover novel medications, more innovative medications. So there's that concern, but the flip side of that, as we heard, is that benefits for employers are not a stable fact that could change. And so again, the idea of a universal system that would provide coverage to all would be ideal, indeed. And then, yeah, so as I mentioned, access to higher cost and new therapies is a little bit questionable, and mainly around the questions are where the money would come from. So the $15 billion per year that would be allocated to the new system. Questions, where would that come from? And individuals who are currently benefiting from private plans, in the sense that they have access to more expensive medications, there is, of course, the concern that they would cease to have that access. Fiscal sustainability of universal single-payer public system is, another question that comes up and is at forefront of people's discussions. So, as we heard, there are just over $30 billion spent on prescribed drugs. This is based on data that came out of CIHI in 2018. And so there are anticipated savings with the PharmaCare plan, but I think, again, there's just more information that's needed to satisfy people or Canadians in terms of how exactly, how affordable and sustainable universal system would be. Indeed, there will be a large shift of privately spent dollars to public expenditures. Again, question is how will that impact, or what will be the ramifications and other public health programs, for instance? Because, and I think it's important to view PharmaCare, and this was brought up by some of by our patient colleagues here as well, is that there are other issues to consider, other factors to consider when we're talking about health and health outcomes. And pharmaceutical treatments are one component of a gamut of interventions, of health interventions that produce or that result in poorer or better health outcomes. And social determinants of health is another, introduce other factors that need to be considered within the context. So I think viewing PharmaCare in that context of all the other health interventions that are required and require public dollars for people to benefit and indeed see better health outcomes is important. In terms of equity, and again, I mentioned this a little bit at the beginning, is that equity is indeed very important, but can be viewed in different lenses. And certainly we don't want to take away, the system has to be such, or the plan, the program has to be such that patients that are currently benefiting from medicines that are crucial to their health outcomes will not be deprived of that. They have, so this actually comes from, we did a report in 2017, was an Understanding the Gap, and this work highlighted some of the, some of the information that was already spoken to around what the gaps are in terms of who is the underinsured, the insured, the public Canadians who have public benefits versus those who have private. And we also did just recently, and it's not publicly available yet, but we looked at, as part of our National PharmaCare Initiative, as one of the research pieces, we specifically looked at patient experience in accessing medications. And to start off, we worked with patients with diabetes and patients with arthritis. And the kind of commonalities between in our findings between the two reports was that the reality keeps coming through, that patients that have access to private coverage do have access to a more extensive formulary and are able to and have access to more novel, innovative medicines compared to individuals on public plans. So those are sort of the facts that keep coming out through our research. But again, if that can be addressed through a universal system and everybody, including those, mainly those people who do not currently benefit from private insurance, can have access to those innovative medicines and have access to a broad array of active ingredients that may be particularly effective for them, then that's certainly something that would be of interest to all. But again, those details still need to be worked out. And as a result, in the meantime, there are questions about how that would be accomplished. So again, some of the work that was conducted and the consultations that were conducted as part of our work in the national kind of pharmacare space it suggested that they kind of highlighted some of the risks that are associated, and certainly there have been some threats is a strong word, but made by the private industry, by the pharma industry, that if under the system, if there's less private money coming into the system, there will be fewer dollars available for research and development in the pharma area, and pharmaceutical companies would not be incentivized to invest in Canada, which would of course mean at the end of the day that Canadians overall would have less access to innovative medicines. So these are just concerns that are raised. Again, question marks. There are no answers to these questions just yet. But I think it speaks to the importance of looking at still, and I know that there's constantly work being done around it, but looking at which gaps really do exist in the system, and ensuring that while we're seeking to achieve equity, we at the same time at the forefront look at patient outcomes and really put a lot of stress on what is important for patients, and so that to ensure that patient representativeness in any of these discussions is crucial, because otherwise the decisions would not be well informed. So this all speaks to the need for a systems approach. And, as suggested there, systems thinking is around understanding the interrelationships and perspectives of patients, prescribers, and health professionals, public and private insurers, employers, and manufacturers. And it also considers a systems perspective, suggests or highlights the need to not look at or consider and have discussions around pharmacare in isolation from all the other healthcare interventions that are important to achieve health outcomes for patients, or the optimal health outcomes for patients. And so the fundamental question is what is the policy objective of a national pharmacare program, and why do you want and need it? And of course, the advisory council considered this was the key question. But we need to keep hammering home that it's about ensuring better health outcomes that are measurable, tangible improvements in quality of life for patients. And who can tell us better about what quality of life means for a patient other than the patients themselves? So it's not about the physician's or clinician's perspective on what they think a patient wants, but rather it's about what the patients themselves want. And of course, those outcomes and those desirable outcomes will vary across patient groups. And so these measurable outcomes need to be measured in very specific patient populations. We can suggest that a patient with prostate cancer has similar desirable outcomes to a patient with breast cancer, because their outcomes that are meaningful to them will vary considerably. It's not only about was the surgery successful, yes or no. It's about the full trajectory of care, and whether the patient is back, is living a life that under the circumstances they would optimally choose to live. So all in all, it talks about a move, or the need for a move from a focus on cost containment to a focus on value. And so again, with pharmacare, there's a lot of questions around dollars and, okay, well, where will the public dollars come from? And so people do get really hung up on dollars, and, industry suggesting that that they will not be able to invest because of dollars. But, we do need to start with the patient outcomes and move from there. Better health outcomes for all, in fact, and, it speaks to social determinants of health and preventive measures as well. Because, again, pharmaceutical treatment is only one component of that, and diabetes is actually a perfect example of this, where the predictors of diabetes, such as obesity and obesity, and I was going to say something else, but anyway, obesity, let's say, there's a lot of, on the prevention side, that could be done in order for patients with diabetes to better manage their condition. So it's not only it's not only the role of pharmaceuticals to help patients manage their health concerns, but on the system overall. So patient outcomes, and specifically the measurement of patient-reported outcomes to inform care, is crucial in this. And I don't know how we compare to other countries in terms of health outcome measurement, but we're not great at it in Canada. And there's, certainly a lack of, consistency in how outcomes are measured, and so it's difficult to benchmark and for jurisdictions to compare how they're performing. So again, of course, a system that would be a national system that would standardize and have a more systematic way of collecting outcome measures, both clinical as well as patient-reported, would be ideal. This slide here, so many of you are, as I mentioned, maybe familiar with the concept of value-based healthcare. Some of you are maybe familiar with just the idea, not the terminology. But ISHOM, the Institute, oh my goodness, Louise, you can fill in for me here. Institute for Collaborations in Health Outcomes Measurement, thank you. Collects patient quality data on a variety of diseases. I believe they have 22 sets for 22 different diseases developed to this point. They continue to work on developing and validating others. And so this is an example of an evidence-based way to collect patient outcome data and gather and track patient experience. And, again, as our patient representatives mentioned today, it's to get that patient experience across is difficult, and organizations and regulators ask for more evidence-based scientific data from patients. So this is, having a standardized measure that is accepted by systems, by clinical settings, clinical environments, as well as by health systems, would be crucial to to facilitate that process and ensure that the patient voice is actually grounded in evidence-based data. So what we're doing here in Canada is, and so these ISHOM standard sets, they're just one example. There are others. PROMIS is another organization that has developed some standard sets around patient-reported outcomes. What we're doing in Canada is under the purview of Value-Based Healthcare Canada, that was launched by the Conference Board of Canada. As I mentioned, it's our key strategic focus right now to truly have impact in healthcare in Canada. we are pulling together or synthesizing the good work that has been done by other organizations such as CFHI. CIHI has some patient report outcomes around hip and knee replacement. We want to coordinate the efforts, or we are coordinating the efforts that have taken place in Canada to date. We are, through policy research, we are exploring and examining the policy barriers and opportunities that exist across jurisdictions to understand how ready a jurisdiction, or maybe it comes down to a health authority or even a clinical environment, might be how ready they might be for implementing approaches to healthcare transformation that are aligned with value-based healthcare principles. Value-based healthcare, by the way, I'll stick to this. Value-based healthcare is a concept that was well defined and officially formally defined by Porter and Tisberg from Harvard University. And so we're building, our foundation is built on work that has been recognized and is well documented. We're building on examples of VBHC applications in Europe. Of course, it's a lot easier to move forward with healthcare transformations in countries like Holland or Denmark, where it's just a smaller context that we're dealing with. And part of so we're doing this policy research to understand the readiness in the landscape, the policy landscape for an approach that is really focused on the patient voice, as well as kind of scrutiny or true measures of efficiencies in the system, and looking at ways to bring more efficiencies. So not by cutting costs, but rather looking at the long-term impacts of an intervention, for instance, and how by initial higher investments, potentially, we achieve better patient outcomes, which in turn have lower costs to the system because a patient is not being readmitted, they don't have complications, etc. So it literally looks at, the idea is to consider the basket of services that a patient in the ideal and the optimal situation would have access to in obtaining or in experiencing the best possible patient outcomes. And in part of in terms of our applied research, so there's a policy research piece, the applied research piece, we're launching some demonstration projects whereby we're validating and or developing new standard sets that are applicable to the Canadian context. And we will be certainly working with and engaging more patient groups in this work because, as I mentioned earlier, to get at the patient outcomes, the outcomes need to be very specific to that patient group. And so we continue to reach out and engage patient groups in this work to ensure that our work is well informed, as well as our other stakeholders, of course. And I will leave it at there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for that. And I will introduce our last speaker. So Louise Binder, she's a lawyer and health advocate who's been involved in informing the development of health policy and systemic treatment access practices from a patient perspective since the early 1990s, subsequent to her own HIV diagnosis. She co-founded the Canadian Treatment Action Council in 1996, and Louise began similar work in the cancer area and is presently a health policy consultant with the Save Your Skin Foundation. So welcome, Louise.
So that isn't my title. I did not put that title for my slides, and I'm not going to be saying that. And I know I'm the last thing between you and lunch, so you'll just have to bear with me. But I have no slides. I speak from my own heart, I guess. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I think it's wonderful that there's growing engagement in patients and public policy. And so I think it's terrific that you've invited me to join you. I know, Diane, that I'm probably going to come off your Christmas card list, your invitations for Easter dinner and several other invitations that I'm sure you are going to give me before this. But I have to tell you that the great pharmacare debate that's raging now is the third great pharmacare debate that I've lived through. And I've lived a long time, which was a big surprise to me, I can tell you. But I want to make a prediction that you're not going to like very much, and that is that we're going to have the same outcomes in this third outing that we've had in the last two outings, which is a huge zero. And I'm going to tell you why I think that. But first, I don't want you to think that my prediction is because I don't think this is a really important issue. This is a hugely important issue, and I regret very much that the federal government, in its wisdom, didn't include drugs in the Canada Health Act, but it didn't, okay? And my joke about that is always that if the fathers of that legislation had been the mothers of that legislation, we would have had drugs in that legislation, but we don't. So it's left to the provinces to manage this through their own devices. So, as I say, I absolutely believe that there should be drug coverage, equal and equitable access for drug coverage for everybody across this country. And it shouldn't matter whether they're drugs or biologics, and it shouldn't matter where they live. It shouldn't matter how much money they have access to. Everybody should be getting optimal, realistic quality of life and quantity of life given their condition, and as I say, regardless of where they live or how much money they have. So that's what I believe in. And we talk in this country about our pride in our universal health care, but we don't have universal health care. As I've said, we don't have drug coverage except at the largesse of the provinces because the federal government didn't include that in the Canada Health Act. And by the way, they're never going to reopen it to do that. And we also, in fact, don't really have universal hospital coverage or doctors coverage either, but that's probably a subject for the next public policy forum we can talk about. So I want to tell you why I predict that we're going nowhere fast on this. And, but I want to start first just making sure that we all know where we are now. We're all on the same page about where we are now. So as I've said, we don't have any federal jurisdiction on drug coverage except in hospitals, and that's because hospitals are under the Canada Health Act, not drugs. And so the provinces have tried to pick up the slack as best they can in this area, and I give them credit for doing that. So the difficulty, of course, is that all provinces aren't created equal. They aren't economically equal. They have different populations. They have different political leanings. And in terms of priorities, their budgets are different as well. So thus, we have what is always referred to as this patchwork quilt, the proverbial patchwork quilt of drug coverage based on, which is exacerbated even within provinces by where you live geographically and definitely by your access to money, and that's just how it is. So that's where we are, but where do we want to be? And I guess where we want to be depends very much on the stakeholder group that you're talking to, because pharmacare means different things to different groups. And unless you know what problem you're trying to solve, you're going to have a different solution. For every problem you think you're trying to solve with pharmacare, you're going to have a different solution. And unfortunately, in my humble opinion, there's the ideologues, and I have to say that the report that came out from Hoskins, in my opinion, is completely written by the ideologues, who tend to be the academics and the unions, particularly a strong support by the nurses union, which is complete puzzlement to me. And I'd also like to point out that there's been a lot of private plan support for this. But, you know, I don't understand it. It's the academics and the union folks and these people with these high salaries and the bureaucrats, they're the ones who already have private coverage, fabulous private coverage, which I highly doubt they're willing to give up for pharmacare. And they've also got good salaries or wages. So if they need something more, they can probably afford to get it. So it's very nice for them to sit up in their ivory towers and tell us that, you know, we should all have drugs for all the people all the time, and it should be managed in a public system, and we really don't need private insurance except for just the little massages here and there that you might like to get. And so it's really, and by the way, we're really just, you know, it'll be all good because the federal government can manage it. So that's the ideologues. That is not my camp, and I would suggest to you that it's not the camp of most patients and patient groups. We're pragmatists. Patients are pragmatists. We'd like to actually just stay alive. We'd like to have a decent quality of life, and we'd like the federal and provincial public systems to do the best that it can with our taxpayers' dollars to get that for us. We want to have no barriers like co-pays and deductibles and dispensing fees when we can't afford them. And we really just want equality across this country to life-saving therapies. And for instance, like in Ontario, oral cancer drugs, which everybody else can apparently afford to pay for, but Ontario can't. So if the federal government really wants to help us, why don't they fill in some of those gaps? That would be really nice to keep people alive while we're waiting for the great utopian public system that's going to give everybody everything all the time. And I just don't, you know, maybe we could just start with a few small steps. I think that most patients would probably be really happy if we did that instead of waiting for the great beyond, because we're all going to end up in the great beyond while we're waiting for the great utopian beyond. And unfortunately, as I said, the ideologues seem to have taken the ear of the federal government in the Hoskins report. And basically, what it talks about is we should have a new federal drug agency. Why, in heaven's name, do we need another federal agency? Why? We already have the Health Canada. We already have CADTH. Well, it's mostly paid for by the provinces, but some federal money. We already have the Patent and Medicine Prices Review Board, which allegedly is going to make drugs so cheap in Canada that we're just going to have scads of them all over the place, and we won't know what to do with all our extra money. Why do we need a new agency? To negotiate prices? I thought that's what the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance was doing. I just don't understand this. It's completely puzzling to me. And why do we need another list of drugs that are probably going to be so basic with their World Health Organization? That list is for the third world. I don't want that list. I want something a little bit better than that list. It's not good enough. And we've already got lots of coverage through a lot of plans in this country. I don't see the point of another list of drugs that will be obsolete, and don't tell me they're going to cover expensive rare diseases. I don't believe a word of that. It's going to cover all the cheap generic drugs. And you know what the provinces are going to do? They're going to get out of the business. They're going to say if it's already on the federal plan, we'll just stop paying for them. You go to the federal government and let them give you your cheap generic drugs. We don't need to pay for those anymore. So I don't buy any of what's going on in that report, as you can probably tell. And at least, thank goodness, the finance minister federally doesn't seem to be too hot on it either, because he knows what we all know, which is that health is a losing proposition for politicians. It's a bottomless pit, and we never know what it's going to cost. And you can sometimes please some of the people some of the time, but you never please all of the people all of the time. So it's really not going to do very much for us. So I really want to say that if the federal government wants to help, then ask the patients what they really want. You talk about patient engagement. Your report, I'm sorry, did not speak to me. It may have spoken to some patients, but it sure didn't speak to me. Didn't do a thing for any of the people that I know. So what I would say is, you want to get rid of co-pays, deductibles, and dispensing fees. Pay for those. Pay for those for people who are too poor. I've got no problem with that. But not $2, not $5. Just get rid of them. Because if you can't afford $5, can't afford $2, you can't afford anything. It's that or food. So just get rid of all that. Help the provinces that way. Help the provinces by looking at the real inequities like oral cancer drugs and make sure that everybody across this country who's got cancer, of which one of two of us apparently are going to in our lifetime, can at least get their cancer drugs paid for if they're out of the hospital. That's the kind of stuff you could really do that would help us out. And then we could take a look at what are the best lists provincially. Everybody tells me Quebec is the best list provincially. I don't pretend to know, but they certainly have lots of drugs on it. Maybe you want to pay so that all the provinces can bring up the list of drugs that they have to the Quebec list if that's the one that people think is the best. These are really great. And if you could do that while we're waiting for the great utopia that is proposed in the Hoskins report, that would be really a good thing. And then maybe we could stay alive to wait for this great utopia that's going to happen. So on October 1st, if any of you have nothing to do between 6 and 9 o'clock at night, you can turn on iPolitics, or you can come to Ottawa to the iPolitics event that we're going to be putting on, at which we're going to be comparing all of the health platforms of the major parties against a survey that we did asking Canadians what they'd really like from federal parties in health. And I have a feeling that not all the parties are going to fare very well, but we'll wait and see because we don't have all the platforms yet. So this is what we really, I think, really need. And I just don't buy the argument that any list of drugs that the federal government's going to put in is going to cover these enormously expensive drugs that you referred to. I don't think New Zealand is any place you want to go and live in drug coverage. They have the fewest drugs covered anywhere in the Western world. Really? Everybody gets them, but they're not getting very much of anything at all. I don't know why they don't all have private insurance. They should. I just don't believe in another agency to negotiate. Why would the federal government be negotiating the price of drugs when they don't pay for drugs? It's the provinces that do. PCPA, if it's not doing a good enough job, give it the resources to do it. Why do we need another central federal data agency? We already have CIHI. Just work out a deal with Quebec so the data that's in CIHI includes Quebec, and then we'll suppose that we've already put a bundle of money into this. Now we're going to start all over again with another federal data agency. I don't know. And if you really want a trusting partnership with patients, federal government, you know what you could really do for us? You could put a pot of money aside so that we can do our advocacy and we don't get criticized because we'd have to take money from the pharmaceutical industry to do our advocacy, because even though we've begged the federal government for funding to do it objectively so we won't be criticized, they've wrote us back and said, forget it, as did all the provinces, by the way. So I do agree with you on one point, though, Diane, and it's a really important one. I agree with you that we need to streamline drug regulation, and we need to get drugs access into people's hands right away. But with all due respect, I don't see anything in the Hoskins report that's going to take us there. I just don't, and I really wish I did, because I want national pharmacare. But what I'm surprised about is that people don't ask the federal government. And I would put it to you, when somebody knocks on your door, any party, anywhere, ask them, do you believe in pharmacare? And if they say yes, then say, what do you mean by that? Because I think you're going to find that what they're offering and what we as patients want are completely horses of a different color. So thank you for that. As I say, come out to the iPolitics event if you're interested. And if you're interested in value-based healthcare, which I am, we also have our Patient Summit on November 12th and 13th. It's free, and we even have patient scholarships if you'd like to come out and talk some more about all of these issues. So I'm sorry that I kept you from lunch, but I hope that at least I provoked a few questions.
Thank you for that, Louise, and to all of our speakers. So we're just going to break really quickly. Everyone gets their food now. So what we're going to do is just ask everyone, grab a bite to eat, grab your plate, take your seats, and then we will treat you to a little Q&A session. So get some food, get your questions, and we'll see you back here in 10, 15 minutes, max. Great, okay. So that was a really great discussion on pharmacare and a lot of, obviously differing opinions and ideas about what is going to be happening. So I thought that first off, I'll open it up. Does anyone have any questions right now and for our panelists? Right here in the front, yes.
I just wanted some more perspective on some of the recommendations that were made by the council led by Eric Hoskins. I noted in the presentation that you mentioned that one of the primary focuses was to make sure that you were covering those who were uninsured or underinsured. But where I'm confused is if that was the primary goal, I don't see how taking in a single payer model would really address those gaps, because I just picture for myself, I have private insurance for drugs. I wouldn't need national pharmacare to be paying for some of my medication because it's covered by private insurance. But there may be someone who, like you said, may be on contract and they would benefit from that. But shouldn't private insurance be that first payer instead of me costing the government money? So again, if we're looking to address the gaps in access to medicines, then why not have it so it's a first and second payer model?
Is this on? Yeah, okay, good. Well, that's a good question, and it's a really huge question. I didn't go into it in the slides, but we looked at what are the values you want to enshrine in this, and there's no question the portability, the fairness, the equity, the universality, these all were issues that needed to be looked at. And when you come down to it being the only country in the world without any kind of national plan for drugs, when we have universal health and doctors and hospitals, really became an overriding concern. And the other part that became really evident as we traveled the country was that the gaps are different in every single province. So I couldn't just pick one slice and say, well, we're going to do this and this will cover the gap, because the gap is enormously different in the Maritimes than it is in BC. And every province has a different plan completely, and different parameters for their plans, and the whole works. So the complexity of it is huge. And in one discussion I had, they said that if you design a plan for poor people, you will have a poor plan. Is that what we want again, a two-tier system with a poor plan for people who have nothing, and the private coverage for those of us that are more fortunate? I also think another big underlying concern is the changing nature of the workforce, which means those of us with good benefit plans are going to be in a declining number, and that those plans, even though we think in our own minds that we have coverage, when I don't say this, shit, it's bad. When you get to get to need it. Yeah. When you need the drug, you suddenly realize it's not available. We talk to a lot of young people, particularly, who really have rose-colored glasses and think they have coverage until they get sick, and then they realize they don't have coverage. So that's a huge problem too. So we need to be able to assure that there's equity across the country. That's part of it.
One thing I thought, I'll ask this to Monica, but there is this idea of having the high and low priority drugs, and so just wondering, within the regulations of the PMPRB, so how do those decisions get made, and how do you involve patients in that process?
I was kind of waiting for you to pass it back. I was like, I have my own. Okay. In terms of how the decisions get made, maybe I'll kind of put that, and maybe Louise can even speak to that. Around engaging patients in the process, and I hate to keep coming back to this idea of value-based healthcare, but it's about getting engaged patients by helping patients be heard. And it sounds like what we heard from our colleagues here this morning, that they're, in some ways being scrutinized because they get funding from the industry, and then their voice is, not taking all that seriously as a result. and they just don't have the resources to collect data and conduct research in a way that will be taken or that will be seen as credible. So, you know, through our this Pan-Canadian initiative that we have launched, the idea is to help patients, or actually measure outcomes on behalf of patients with patients, to produce that evidence. And I think that's how patients' voices can be better heard, and that's how we can ensure that outcomes that are meaningful to patients are at the forefront of these conversations. And you know, I think the realities are, as we heard, and we all have family members, friends who I shouldn't say all, but I imagine, you know, given the stats, that have been affected by cancer. And it's really sad. Just actually a few days ago, we lost a close family friend who is young, in his early 60s, had a family, and went from, and these little patient, these anecdotes really mean, so he had severe back pain about 8 months ago. The doctor told him he needed rehab because there's something, his spine is off. Went through rehab, pain continued to get worse but very quickly escalated, a few weeks. And then further tests that took forever for him, to get the diagnostics necessary. Found out that he had a tumor on his spine, he had lung cancer, and within just on the weekend passed away because he also had pancreatic cancer. In the meantime, he was in a hospital setting where his family had to watch him suffer in excruciating pain. His brothers, his older brothers, his son who's in his 20s, his wife. And I just, but they're not highly educated people. I know they didn't ask the right questions, and he was supposed to get results back, and I kept asking, so when are the results coming? Oh, next week that week turned into, and in 3 weeks we'll know. And patients don't always know the questions they need to ask. And, I wondered, and of course, it's such a personal matter, but I wondered, did they even ask, are these treatments that are causing him so much pain? In the end, we all know he's dying. He's dying in a hospital bed. He'd rather be at home, maybe for a shorter period of time. And so these are the sort of, and I know that their voice probably will never be heard because they're not researchers. They're not out there. They're a regular family that, now he's had the funeral, and that's that, and that's where it ends. And so I think having the patient experience heard and really understanding what outcomes are meaningful to the patients and to caregivers is, it's important in these discussions.
Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Louise?
Well, I'd like to go back to Diane's point that what we have across this country is very different province to province. And so I go back to saying if the federal government wants to help that problem, the way to do it isn't to create some generic, no pun intended, list of drugs that may or may not already be covered either publicly or privately, and create an agency to negotiate prices when we already have an agency that negotiates prices. What I would say is ask the patients and the provinces what each of them needs. And I think that those needs in some ways will not be different. It's mostly about the working poor, mostly. And they'll tell you, if you can pay, we spend X on co-pays and deductibles and so on for our poorest working people. If you can make sure that they really get in the system, not just theoretically get in the system, then do that. I mean, I just don't understand the argument that because there are different problems in different provinces, the way to solve that is you just create some generic list of drugs. It doesn't work. It's not going to do anything for anybody.
Can I say a few words, Carl?
Please.
Just a bit, but the idea, I think, is pretty clear in the report that it isn't to create a new agency and keep all the old ones. It's to roll the functions of all of the regulatory agencies into one agency so that you have things coordinated and cohesive and tight for the whole province and the whole country, and that all the provinces have a big role in it, just as they do in CADTH and in the PCPA. Because right now, even there's gaps between what each agency does. So it wouldn't be to duplicate what agencies do today, it would be to streamline what's happening today, to improve informatics, to improve data, to improve the ability to serve Canadians.
But the federal government, but you can't do that. You can't make the provinces do anything. So, like, I just don't understand. Why don't you work with what they are already doing instead of you telling them that everything they're doing isn't any good and that the federal government knows how to do it better? Because they never buy it when you do that. All you do is alienate the provinces, and they're looking to be alienated anyways, so that they can, it's like we're better and we're smarter. It just doesn't work, and it's just going to keep patients from getting what they really need.
Well, I think patients are not getting what they need right now. We heard that 1 in 5 Canadians have that difficulty, 20%. It's way more than the number that aren't insured or eligible for insurance, because even people with insurance aren't getting enough help to actually afford their drugs. And the cost of drugs are enormously changing. In a very short period of time, we went from having 40 drugs that cost more than $10,000 a year. 10 years later, it's 140 drugs on the provincial formularies that cost more than $10,000 a year. And those provincial plans are reeling from that. They're looking for help from the federal government.
So are you going to put all those drugs on there? Are you going to put all those expensive drugs on your list?
They're on there now.
They're not. In Ontario, oral cancer drugs are not paid for. You going to put those drugs on your federal list? I don't believe it.
I certainly, one of the issues certainly that does often come up, and you raise a really good point, is that as we get these more and more expensive drugs, how do these programs approach it? And now I've spoken to some policy experts who suggest, the benefit of having a one-payer solution is that then you can start to negotiate, because we know that in Canada we're often paying much higher prices because we don't see the list, like the actual prices that other countries are paying. They're all confidential, and so Canada is often paying much higher prices. So I think you both, this is not an easy answer. There's no easy answers here, and we're in a rapidly changing system. But I'm just going to move on and just ask if the audience has any more questions, because we are going to wrap up. We have time for maybe one more question. Yes, go ahead, please.
I just had a question, and this is kind of on topic for what you just said. In the report, he's mentioning that National Pharmacare is going to save us tons and tons of money. And I just wonder how, where's the evidence in stating that? Because I just think, well, yes, we're negotiating as a country, but the role of the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance is to bring all provinces, all jurisdictions together, including Quebec, so that we can negotiate a fair price for drugs that can go out to all the public plans. So what would be the difference between the PCPA and negotiating nationally? Because essentially I see them as doing the same thing. So where are we saving money under a national, where we're negotiating nationally compared to what we already do now with the PCPA? I do understand that technically there are gaps, of course, where I'm from Cystic Fibrosis Canada. There are drugs that may be available in one province, not in the other, or be on special authorization in one province, or under what we call a cystic fibrosis drug plan. So of course, yes, there's not a lot of alignment, but I just want to know, where do we see that we'll be saving money as well as addressing those gaps?
Well, the PCPA has done a good job, but they're sort of doing the preparatory work for the provinces, who then go out and finalize their prices. Each province still negotiates. So they set a price and then off you go. We don't know in this opaque world of pricing how that actually pans out, because there's all kinds of rebates. We don't know what Ontario's rebate is vis-a-vis Nova Scotia's or Newfoundland's or anywhere else. There's a lot of unknowns, so we just know the total drug spending. But drug by drug, it's very, very big for each province to go out and do the final negotiating individually. So it's still not a final price for the country. It's a set price, a list price. And they agree that they're going to go out and aim for this list price. But each province and each plan is still on their own at the end of the day.
That's not the way I understand it. I understand that the provinces come together and they negotiate together. And yes, it is true that after that, the province will make the decision if they actually want to list that drug. But the price is set across the board. Now, I suppose if they can negotiate even a lower price, but that doesn't happen for one province over another. I don't think that's right. If you really want to do us a favor, what you want to do is work with PCPA so that they create risk-sharing agreements with the companies so that they pay for performance. And there's a shared risk between the companies and the governments about, we pay for the stuff that works, we don't pay for the stuff that doesn't work. And we don't need a new agency to do that. We just need to get better agreements with PCPA.
Well, it's interesting you mention that because that is in the report, the idea of paying for performance, but particularly in the area of the rare diseases, where we don't have a lot of information or maybe enough evidence going in, but we're willing to try a drug, but we don't want to pay until you prove that it is effective in doing what it claims to do. So I think that has a lot of merit as well, but I do see it particularly in that category of expensive drugs for rare diseases.
Not just.
Maybe other new drugs that come on board.
Well, yeah, because what we're learning is that so many diseases are genetically linked. So we should be paying for the diagnostics, and they shouldn't be, you didn't talk about this in your report either, is how diagnostics are separated from the treatments. And that is going to be more and more untenable as more and more drugs are going to be genetically linked, and where we're going to need those diagnostics in order to do the treatments. You're going to pay for the diagnostics? I don't see that either.
I think you will see that the report is very long, 60 recommendations. It's about 100 pages long, and then appendices. It covers a lot. There's many things we couldn't go into. There's threads, as all of you know in your own respective work, a lot of threads that come off this around prescribing and who prescribes. I think Conference Board has looked at that. How do we prescribe or de-prescribe? How do we work with patient groups in more detail? There's so many things that we could do more. How are drugs dispensed? Pharmacies and the role of pharmacies and pharmacists hardly touched in the report. Hugely important in the whole delivery of drugs to the patient. So there's an awful lot more to be done, but that's why we believe there needs to be this preparatory foundational work done, which is now underway really with the transitional office that started in Ottawa.
And I'll give, we're about to wrap up, but I'll give the final word to Monica just to wrap up on what we just heard.
I'm just going to touch on PMPRB because I don't think that question was answered, and certainly Louise and Diana do add in. But PMPRB is proposing to use different countries as comparable countries, as we know, and also they establish the ceiling price for medications. But if at the end of the day, in the current scenario, it's the provinces that frankly, provinces that know their patients, their population the best, and they know where the gaps exist, and they have a better sense as to what medications are particularly, like, as you mentioned the case with, and I can't remember the name of the Fabry, but, whether the PMPRB is in the best position to be making the decisions around, allowing access of a drug into the country or not is, a question mark around that. And then, maybe I'll just, as a wrap-up, again, highlight the fact that pharmaceutical treatment is just one component of the full treatment, or the full cycle of care for any patient or a person. I wouldn't define myself currently as a patient because knock on wood, luckily right now I'm not suffering from anything that I require regular treatment for. However, that could change tomorrow, and then I do become a patient. In the meantime, what I can do as a non-patient, if you will, is take preventive measures. But again, the public healthcare system needs to support those as well. Support our children to ensure that they are physically active enough and that they get the right diet to prevent some of these chronic illnesses or help mitigate them anyhow. So in the full discussion, this is something that, we need to make sure that they're not siloed conversations. And then, because it's, in the end, it is all about money. And if we can save the government and our every person in Canada money by reducing the burden on the healthcare system, then many of these conversations could be toned down to a different level.
Thank you for that, and thank you all for this. And this has been a great discussion. I'm going to pass it back to George now, who will wrap things up for us.
Well done. Thank you all for a lively discussion. I'm glad, Carly, I'm glad I didn't have your job. You did a great job. Thank you to all the speakers, some of which are still here today. Carly, in particular to you, we made you do a lot of hard work today and a lot of heavy lifting, and you did a great job. And so please, a big round of applause for everybody, our speakers, our moderator. So we've had a great conversation today, and I'm sure you'll agree that we've been able to glean some insights as to what's needed and to at least some of the progress, and maybe even just the common ground that we can make quick wins on has been suggested that we can move forward on while the implementation of the report continues. So after listening to all of our experts, it's easy to see that there are many opportunities, as I mentioned, that we can leverage and grow patient engagement in the healthcare and policy arena in order to provide more patient experience and insight to regulators. And even if this only inspired elevating the patient voice even more into everything that we do, I think it's a process, but a process that hopefully is continuing to work. And as a result, we achieve better patient outcomes. There's going to be a white paper that is produced, as we have produced in the past. If you haven't seen the white papers that we have produced already over the previous 4 or 5 policy forums, please visit our website. But there will be a white paper with written recommendations coming out of this forum, which we'll share with all of you. But in the meanwhile, we're also going to circulate a recording of today's forum. So some of you will have the pleasure of hearing yourselves again. Thank you all again to the speakers, and in particular, thank you to the sponsors that give us the capacity to be able to elevate the patient voice as we take this journey, AstraZeneca, GSK, and Takeda, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.